This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country? Subliminal.
Jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will.
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people have so much to gain and have such a material motive for putting a position on them. We'll never let the true facts come of their boards to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
These people are in very high positions, Jack.
A store bill's the first thing I'll pay. A slop parlor suit and a lounge I will buy, and an organ for Bridgie, hooray! Me calico shirt I will throw in the dirt, in a silk one won't I call a shine. And the very first chance I'll put Seamus in pants, when the breakers go back on full time. She'll ne'er stick her fist in the wash tub, and Chinaman he'll have me trade. She'll ne'er pick the coal off the slate bank, we'll buy everything ready-made. We'll dress up our children like fairies, and we'll build up a house big and fine. And we'll move away from the roundheads when the breakers go back on full time. And sure, if the news is true, a store bill's the first thing I'll pay. A slop parlor suit and a lounge I will buy, and an organ for Bridgie, hooray! Me calico shirt I will throw in the dirt, in a silk one won't I call a shine. And the very first chance I'll put Seamus in pants, when the breakers go back on full time. When the breakers go back on full time.
Ooh, welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 240. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we have a very special episode.
Yeah.
Even by SJ standards.
This really is the genesis of SJ in a way, actually. Or it has connections to the genesis of SJ, this particular topic. It's also like the one, I feel like, for whatever reason, like the one thematic episode that we're able to do, or like the one thing where we're able to time the episodes correctly. Well, inshallah, because we don't really know if this is going to come out in time, but we're somehow able to do special episodes for St. Patrick's Day twice in a row.
That's right.
like Halloween, I feel like maybe our first year of doing this, we were able to get an episode out for Halloween. But then since then, we weren't able to do spooky stuff for I feel like we've never matched anything up to a date except for St. Patrick's Day this year and last.
Well, we have to do it. That's right. Yeah, last year we had leprechauns. Yeah. That was a really fun episode, and I think we might have even alluded to saying, next year we got to get to this topic. I think we've said that for a number of episodes because this topic, in addition to, you're right, being literally foundational to the creation of SJ itself, kind of the workshop, the breaker, the shaft, where we labored for several years on our craft before we sort of pivoted into the realm of doing the kind of podcasting that we do, was this story, which, looking back on it now, refreshing myself this week in preparation, I realized, I started making a long list of common, prominent SJ themes that run directly through the story. And, it's quite a long list. I didn't even finish it. But I think a lot of a lot of the topics we sort of honed in on, as well as like our sort of like research style in approaching things, approaching historical kind of stories.
Definitely.
Was really shaped by this.
Yeah.
And I guess we should say we're saying so today we're going to talk about a group of lads in American history from the Gilded Age of the 1870s. And, we'll get into them, in pretty good depth in a moment. But I guess, you all see the title of the episode probably. These gentlemen are called the Maguires. Now, maybe some of you have heard that name thrown around before. You might even seen a movie starring Sean Connery and Richard Harris from 1970 by that same name about the same story. But I'd say also a lot of Americans, even a lot of Irish Americans, Khalid, of which you and I are both half Irish American, perhaps have never heard of this story before. And, I think there are sound sort of political economic reasons for why the story is not more well known and not taught in American sort of textbooks, or when it was spun in very particular directions. But this is, I think, like an incredibly fascinating and like instructive tale in American history on like a variety of levels. Yeah. I think I first came upon it a long time ago, probably in 2009, right after I had graduated college. And I think one of my friends that I grew up with was taking a college class back in California and called me up one day and was like, dude, have you ever heard of this like group called the Maguires? And, he was part Irish too. So, classic Irish American over-identification, like what Irish Americans being badass and unruly and drunk, like count me in. I'm just acknowledging it up front for any Irish listeners. We love you, and we realize that we're very annoying sometimes, the Irish Americans. But we are 50% each Irish. So and I'll say on top of that, because this story takes place in the anthracite coal regions of Pennsylvania. That's like literally, that region is literally where, my Irish side comes from. I think I've mentioned that before, from Scranton, Carbondale, Luzerne, Lackawanna
by way,
County.
Ireland by way of that region,
originally from Ireland. I think I think primarily County Mayo. It's never quite clear either.
We're from Galway, which is proof of like how how Irish Americans are, because like my mom would not be able to tell you like where like our Eastern European like as family like came from, I guess somewhere in Russia. Like I don't know.
It's a similar deal with my Polish side. There's a lot more ambiguity around it, and not caring,
I literally don't even know like I know it was Eastern European, I think Russian, like maybe, like, but I literally don't even know. But anyway, my point is that
Russian
I know
Empire,
exactly what
Ashkenazi
county
Jews,
in Ireland my family's from, and we have like the coat of arms of like our family like on the wall of my house, like some stupid little like printed out piece of paper. Like.
right, little Aquino, the Scottish heraldry,
exactly, kind of like that. Yeah, except not actually having anything other than a last name, just for any speculators out there, not actually titled in any way. It's just like,
the chain of colleges owned by your lord family.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's not true. No. So I'll throw it out here. There's a reason why I did find this story like personally intriguing, because the Irish part of my family, despite I think they're basically what they would call famine Irish, who came over during the potato famines, the induced potato famines, the British induced potato famines in the 1840s. I think, again, in the 1860s, I think all the waves of, Irish ancestors came during those periods up to coal country in Pennsylvania, where this abundant source of energy, I think like most of the anthracite coal in the Western Hemisphere is just in this like region, right? Of like 400 something square miles, kind of between Schuylkill County, which is the center stage of today's story, all the way up to Carbondale, which is where my grandmother's family lived. And so tons of immigrants flooded into these regions, of course. Lots of Irish people, lots of Irish Catholics, who is, I think, like people in my family would like to remind us, were not well received when they came here. Right, Irish Americans love.
Yeah, as we talked about in in our Leprechaun episode, we talked about Nina, which was for my grandfather. Like constantly, just a constant refrain.
I'd hear about that through my mom would tell me that my grandmother would talk about that all the time, and they had memories going back, because they ended up living there for probably, I don't know, 4 generations, and completely Irish, like up until the mid 20th century, basically, so they were both by then pretty Americanized, but also held their kind of like Irish Catholic identity close in a way that like I can't exactly relate to, growing up on the West Coast in the late 20th century, right? It's a little more of like a fun, like drink a Guinness and, just sort of like a fun affectation to put on. But there were some heavy stakes involved because, moving into this mining region and in this era, especially after the Civil War with the industrial explosion in the North, right? There was, a lot of work to be done in these mines, and the conditions were pretty fucking bad, right?
Yeah.
So my friend, calls me and tells me this whole story over the phone for like an hour because he like read some book in a class about it, and like by the end of it, I'm just like so enthralled. It's like, did you know there was like a secret society of like Irish immigrants, and they were getting fucking screwed over in the mines and like treated like shit and stuff. So some of them started dressing up in costumes and like dressing up like women and going around just like assassinating like mine bosses and, government officials and all this shit. And then all these powerful people got together and then they like arrested these guys, but then they framed a bunch of them who didn't actually do shit. And then there was this spy who was this Irish guy who got sent in there who was a Pinkerton and blah, blah, blah. And it was this huge thing. And I was like, holy shit. I did not know all this action, was going on up there. And at the time, we met in basically like film school. I was into like writing screenplays at the time. Yeah. And I think, I went and found the movie that this is based on, which maybe we'll talk about a little later in terms of like historical representations of this story,
we were
which
really in writing school. Like, as I was more of a playwright.
I know
you're more of a screenwriter.
Yeah, you weren't fully sullied by the Hollywood, whatever. And that's what I was like, interested in. But like historical stuff.
I just don't want to be portrayed as someone who went to film school because I feel like that's
all right.
I don't know. No, it's a little bit more pathetic. I mean, and not to say that it's like cool to,
No, right, yeah. But like that's where we had kind of started like collaborating on stuff.
Yeah, we did
like
collaborate on a bunch of like projects for the screen. Scripts, not like actual things.
Those scripts, none of which ever got made or sold or anything like that.
Yeah,
but
for a while you had like management in LA and. We would take stuff around.
Right. Yeah. And what feels like a completely different eon of.
I mean, it was like 10 years ago.
I know. I know, but I mean,
like this all started like 10 years ago.
But I just mean in terms of the mood of Hollywood, even 10 years ago compared to now.
Or even 5 years ago, really.
Even 5 years ago.
COVID, as we were just saying before we started recording, COVID just was an absolute sea change in the entire operation of our society.
Right. So, just, setting the stage here. Basically, I think after I had moved to LA and then I was kind of doing this, trying to do the screenwriting thing, I think I had always kept this story like in the back of my head of like, that would be a really interesting thing to like do a new kind of adaptation of like this story because it's so interesting. There's all these different dynamics and stuff. And then I think I finally brought it to you and our other friend who was writing scripts with us.
Yes.
When we were kind of looking for the next thing to work on, I said, what about this story? This is probably in like 2015, maybe, I think.
Yes.
And then I think we all decided that we all fucked with it and thought, actually, there's a lot here we could kind of do. And this is, kind of peak era.
At first, honestly, like,
okay.
I wasn't like all about it. Part of it was that like we were working on this thing that was about like Plymouth Colony. And I was like really into that. And then like Paul Giamatti, like executive producer, made some kind of like mini series that was about Plymouth Colony. So we decided like we couldn't do that for that reason. And then we immediately pivoted to this. And at first, I feel like, you know, my like when you first like ran the concept by me, I was like imagining like, I don't know, it was very like Peaky Blinders, like kind of like, or like, I don't know, like, yeah. Basically,
which was big at the time.
Yeah, like, and I was like,
Irish
I don't know
gangster
about, like, yeah,
period
like, this
piece, of
seems
course.
like I wasn't like super into it.
I
like,
get it.
As we'll get into a little bit later, like what hooked in, like, what hooked me into it a bit more, like later on, was like the spiritual, like religious, like sociological aspect, and like, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that like the research we did for this project did like evolve, or like is certainly reflected, or the interests that were expressed in our interest in this definitely carry over to SJ. But yeah, I and the whole like the fact that like the way that they would be dressing up in these like elaborate costumes and these connections with like Irish mummers traditions and things like that, like that, you know, in those two books, like making sense of the Molly Maguires, and then the later one, the Sons of Molly Maguire, that came out in 2014. Like that angle to it, like the way that this was a continuation of like Irish agrarian secret societies, that was like that was more interesting to me. But at first I was kind of thinking like, what is this, like, you know, is this going to be just like Peaky Blinders? Which, you know, like, you know, it's like,
well, I always felt it would be like it was more rich than whatever like the Peaky Blinders was, or it had its own specific stuff going on. And
it's much more than like, you know.
But I know what you mean though.
Yeah, it's much more than like what your like typical like overexcited like Irish American guy would like imagine upon like hearing the broad strokes of the story. Like, you know, where they're like, they're drinkers, but they're liars and they're men, or like whatever, you know, sorry, they're drinkers and like, you know, like,
flogging Molly. This was not going to be like a flogging Molly soundtrack project in any way.
It's much like different from that.
Right,
like,
right.
Really, when you get into it, it's like there's
maybe
a lot
to our
of, like,
detriment.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
it might have been made if it was, but maybe that's for the best.
Like,
so,
but
no, this isn't gonna be like Boondock Saints. No, certain parallels,
like,
obviously.
Oh, you know, like sticking it to them. But yeah, no, it's super like the connection to the Civil War. And like,
No,
you know,
this is what I think. What I realized, I think what I eventually started like working into sort of like our, you know, quote unquote pitch for this, or just the way that like I thought about it, was that this is a, I think I refer to it as a revisionist Eastern, as opposed to a Western.
Yeah.
Because that was something I noticed when I was trying to like come up with vocabulary to kind of like describe what this was, and I thought there's so many, you know, foundational American films. You could say almost the American film industry itself grew up on Westerns that take place, in many cases, in this exact time period in the same country, the United States, right? Like post-Civil War, 1870s. But then I thought, like, where the fuck are all the movies about what was going on in the Eastern United States in 1875? And all this shit, because we start reading about the broader kind of context and history of this very murky and sensationalist story of the Molly Maguires, and you realize that, like, you know, this is a period of rapidly escalating class antagonism and exploitation and struggle between labor and capital. And, you know, that aspect of the story, another thing, it's like combining these kind of like spiritual and these kind of like interesting like folkloric things, and then also like the hard narrative of like capital v everything, and, you know, this like, you know, a kind of a Marxian interpretation of history, you know, looking at who are really the good guys and the bad guys, et cetera, et cetera. Like all that runs right through this this very real narrative. But then, you know, it almost gets a little bit suspicious that, like, why are there so few movies about just, I don't know, labor struggles in Chicago in the 1890s or Pittsburgh, or even just kind of like crime narratives and things like that? Because another thing that's shown through in this is because it's in kind of the mountainous regions in Pennsylvania, that even though it was only like an hour and a half train to Philadelphia, these were like very kind of cut off, new and like remote, almost frontier-esque kind of towns where a lot of this stuff was happening. And so when you're thinking of like a visual landscape of this, it honestly is more like how you'd picture like Deadwood than, some like big fancy city or something like that. Like even topographically and like aesthetically, it has, and infrastructurally, it has more in common with the quote unquote Wild West. But, Americans, like almost, it's like we've been trained to not think about the Wild East in this time. Because, that's where a lot of silk toppers were doing a lot of crimes to accumulate a lot of fortunes and, build up this great imperial country of ours, right? In the Great Gilded Age. And, this is the period that we covered at length, I think, in, another foundational SJ series, History of the Great American Fortunes.
Which I think
right?
you came upon in
That's
doing
why I
research
found
for
that.
this. Yeah,
you're right.
so,
That's why I found that book, is because we were researching this script. You're right. I didn't even think about that. And so that was the first time I read Gustavus Myers years ago. And that, I think reading Gustavus Myers opened me up to like looking at it in an even wider context.
Yeah,
and
I feel like that was something that happened, especially like with a lot of projects. Honestly, Demon Forces was also a script, which like even in the writing phase ballooned wildly. At one point, this was 300 pages long, listeners. Dimitri's screenplay for the film that later became Demon Forces.
No, it was like 200 and it was like 260. I wouldn't say
okay.
300.
Excuse me. All right.
Sometimes you write a
I'm
draft
sure
and then you slim it down.
I'm sure you're correct. But anyway, my
the amount
point
of stuff
is that,
in it like wouldn't have fit into any movie. You know what I mean? Like
I know.
it was
beyond.
beyond.
I feel like that was part of it. Like it would just like balloon in terms of its like extent. Like it would just balloon out of all like proportion, which is like true of the historical story of the Molly Maguires. Like there's so much, or like, you say the story of the Molly Maguires, it's really about so much more. And like whether there even was such an organization as the Molly Maguires at all is like incredibly undecidable and not something that anyone can really determine. Like historians still disagree on it, and like which is not like the best hook, for like pitching a movie, but like that is in a way like part of what's interesting about it. And then there's just like so much involved in it, but that doesn't really lend itself to like the kind of straightforward like cinematic type of storytelling that usually you want for that type of project, which is I think kind of naturally moved us into the world of doing the 6 hour plus podcast format.
Where no executive can tell us to like slim it down, make it simpler or whatever. It's like, no, we're
stay on topic,
So I mean, I think eventually, as it kind of ballooned, as we did more and more research, I think we got more and more interested in like these other contextual aspects of it, and the sort of meta mystery, the sort of meta detective quest of the story itself, in terms of like the historical unreliability of a lot of sources that sort of built the sort of accepted narrative about them, and how some people by then, Kevin Kenny, of course, who wrote the book Making Sense of the Molly Maguires, which I think is a kind of a central pillar source for us. Not the only one, but pretty good overall. It was published in the 90s. And, like the title suggests, his goal was to demystify and like pin down like who were the Molly Maguires? Were they even real? Or, and this, again, it gets into a very loaded, interesting question, or was this kind of like a psyop created by the president of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company, a man that we ended up injecting into our narrative as the chief antagonist, Franklin B. Gowen. Did he make all this up as part of basically a PR campaign to scapegoat, what was really just sort of like a distributed, not aligned network of like ruffian Irish miners who were striking out in local circumstances, maybe against bosses who weren't treating them fairly, or, were suffering other depredations, et cetera, et cetera. Did he spin this whole yarn about a vast international secret conspiratorial society of Irish Catholics that were undermining the very foundations of our democracy?
It has a lot of resonances with any number of such moral panics about like different groups. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk in this episode about the context of like anti-Irish sentiment at the time, which really was the heyday of that. You know, like, there was that sensationalistic book that came out that was kind of like Michelle Remembers, like, but about like Catholic nuns and like how they were like doing. Yeah, it was like kind of like a McMartin preschool, but like, you know, about nuns and like what they actually get up to and like how they, like this type of thing. But it was, like by this author who was like very not reliable. Yeah, I don't remember what exactly the title was. Let me see if I can find it. But yeah, it was the heyday of that type of Maria Monk's awful disclosures of the Hotel de Nunnery of Montreal. That was it. But yeah, like in that, and of course you can compare that to, I mean, kind of what we're witnessing now, where Americans of Arab descent, or especially Palestinians, are being viewed as like foreign subversives. You know.
Absolutely. There are many, many parallels, I think, especially right now in 2025, that we perhaps couldn't have seen, coming in the mid-2010s, Well, I mean, actually, Trump was coming around then, so I think actually we did draw attention to the sort of the strategic scapegoating of immigrants as this sort of invading force that were undermining our blood and our values and all these other things, because it was very hot, in this period as well. And I think there is a kind of interesting, like, there's a little trick that goes on with the Irish Americans, because today, when we think about Irish Americans, they're just white people, right? Like, I get that there's a specific thing that, an ethnic peculiarity that people might hold on to varying degrees. You get a place like Boston or Philly, you're definitely going to meet some Irish Americans who fucking identify as Irish, right?
Right.
But we all know that, like, we've had 2 Irish presidents. One was killed, the other one was forced out of office. But anyways, that's beside the point. But I think there's an interesting, I don't know exactly like what to call it, but it like brings up an interesting like contradiction when you look back in history and see these kind of white Protestant, good American, blah, blah, blah people just sort of freaking out in public or casting aspersions on this, like, just this animal, venal race of drunkards that, like, everywhere they go, they just like sow destruction. They're nothing like us. Like these English people, they're nothing like us. And then it's like they're talking about, like, Paddy McGowan, who's just like a guy from like Galway, and so you see, like, first of all, that, like, the boundaries of racism like shift over time almost tactically towards like who they need to exclude in order to like protect kind of their own power and privileges, and how this like kind of shifted over time. And then of course there's the thing of like, well, how did the Irish eventually become like white? And therein lies a story that, can be a little almost sad, I think. And this also the Molly Maguire sort of saga perfectly kind of encapsulates like the struggle within the Irish American community to define what was the proper way of being Irish American. And there was a kind of like a fierce struggle that took place in this period where, you had the Catholic Church on one side that was strongly against like the use of any kind of like radical violence or things of that nature, and was also trying to like be in good relations with sort of like they wanted more, mainstream acceptance of Catholicism in America, obviously. And then on the other side, you have like the nascent kind of labor activists, and then you have people that are kind of buying into the more like small businessman, like pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Then of course you have, famously a lot of them just become cops and just, get hired to beat up other poor people, right? And which is, a tradition that went well into the 20th century, or they get into like political machines. But there's a contestation over kind of like ethnic identity going on in all of this, and them being scapegoated kind of like fuels that in a way, because there's this pressure to kind of to assimilate, essentially. Historically, that's what's expected of immigrants in the United States, and they eventually did do it. But I think there's so many elements to the Molly Maguire tale that, sort of like beg the question of like, but how much of their soul did they sell in the process? The idea of them becoming white and not green anymore. And I think whatever you could say about the people.
It should be said that there's a difference between like the ethnic, like, or the form of racism, similar with like Jews or other groups like that, or Italians. There's a difference between that. And like this was definitely like a rift and actually like a meaningful element in like a lot of what was happening in the Schuylkill County during this time, and like the events leading up to the Molly Maguire panic and incidents was like the slavery and its abolition. Because another element of this was that like the Irish population were like, they were staunch Democrats, the Democrats of modern day Republican lore, like the old school Democrats who like were really pro-slavery and like pro-Confederacy. In fact, like in one of the first Molly murders, like they ran out like saying like, calling for Jefferson Davis and stuff like that, So it
was that the Frank Langdon murder?
It was the Bergen murder. I think.
Is that the one where allegedly Blackjack Kehoe like grabbed an American flag and then spat on it and is like, "Fuck your flag" or something like that, and then they're like, "I'm gonna kill you," and then like that was one of
a different guy. Like
that was a Civil War related riot. No, you're right. That's something that we'll get into kind of the contested historiography of the Molly Maguires. I think throughout, we'll probably reference it throughout. There's one book I think that tried to sort of like swing the historical verdict back into a more sympathetic direction in I think the 1930s. That was Anthony Bimba's The Molly Maguires, The True Story of Labor's Martyred Pioneers in the Coal Fields. And I believe Anthony Bimba was like he was either a socialist or a communist, writing in like the dark days of the Great Depression. And this was one of the first narratives that changed what had been the kind of the mainstream accepted thing before that, which was a book by the head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, Alan Pinkerton, who was intimately involved in this entire story and plot, writing a kind of, actually I noticed this yesterday, and it also ties into funny like Hollywood stuff, that, his book, which was I think The Molly Maguires and the Detective, right? Which was published right after the culmination of this whole saga and the trials that would kind of end it, and I think became like a bestseller and was really intended as like an advertisement for how effective his detective agency was. In that, he tells a lot of lies and crafts a narrative, and it was all bullshit. But I noticed that it one of the things it was described as, it was like one of the first like true detective kind of genre books that sort of spawned this whole thing of true detective stories. And I just thought that's like funny, like, because I wonder, when the show came out, True Detective, I had heard that it was sort of based on an old like pulp magazine or something from like back in the 1930s.
Really like a genre in a way, but
it is kind of and it's a very American genre, right? And Pinkerton also published, I was reading last night, he published this kind of like pamphlet of like guides for like a true, I don't know if it was called literally True Detective, but it was kind of like guides for like being a true detective. And it has this kind of like this ethos that he outlines in it of like what a true detective is, which is so not in sync with like what his true detectives did that he hired to set, particularly James McParlin, the man who would infiltrate the Molly Maguires. Let me see if I actually have it right here. And, Alan Pinkerton also, his fortune was kind of forged in the U.S. Civil War when his small detective agency was, I think, hired to protect some railroads, in 1861. And then allegedly he heard about an assassination plot against Abraham Lincoln and like informed on it. And then General McClellan was impressed with that and brought him on as basically the chief of the Union Army's military secret service from 1861 until November 62, which, gave him a kind of like golden sheen. So after that, let's see, 1873, the same year this saga really starts, he published General Principles of Pinkerton's National Detective Agency, which offers some insights into the operating principles. The profession of the detective is a high and honorable calling, Pinkerton declared in his guidebook. Few professions excel it. He is an officer of justice and must himself be pure and above reproach. As such, the detective must not use criminal methods to catch his prey. Nonetheless, the detective generally had to employ devious and covert means in his attempt to enforce justice, Quote, "It cannot be too strongly impressed upon detectives," he capitalizes that, detectives, "that secrecy is the prime condition of successes in all their operations. The detective also had to be something of an actor, possessing the player's faculty of assuming any character that his case may require, and of acting it out to the life with an ease and naturalness which shall not be questioned. Part of this acting inevitably involved playing the role of the criminal." Quote, "It frequently becomes necessary for the detective, when brought into contact with criminals, to pretend to be a criminal." Criminal is also capitalized. "Judged by these standards, James McParland turned out to be an excellent detective." So yeah, this is also the rise of like the private, sort of like, this is before the FBI. This is still 50 years before the FBI would sort of come into being with J. Edgar Hoover. But before you had the FBI, you had these private detective agencies, and Pinkerton stood above them all. And I think it's also relevant to talk, I think today, especially when it almost feels like we might be slipping back into a little bit of a privatized security kind of culture in the United States, where there's new Pinkertons rising up, whether they're, Peter Thiel and Palantir or Eric Prince.
I saw an ad for like a rideshare app that hires you like bodyguards.
Yeah. I mean, so this was, lest we forget, I think sometimes it's good to like remind people of when different things started becoming normal in American history. It's like you think about like, oh, cops, like they always existed. It's like, well, no, like there wasn't really like cops back then. And then there were like slave patrols in the South. And then, even in this era, it's interesting to look at, well, who are the quote unquote police or law enforcement in the coal regions of Pennsylvania in the 1870s? Well, you do have elected town constables in some towns, like, for example, Black Jack Kehoe, who is portrayed by Sean Connery in the film, the alleged ringleader of the Molly Maguires. But actually, I think as we found out in our research, something that's like not emphasized enough is really almost more of like a local political personality than just like a miner who also did like terrorism or, like a bandit or something like that. Like he was a local businessman. He was elected town constable. So technically of Girardville, a tiny little mining town near Shenandoah. And so he did technically have, like some kind of like political office that he held and was like obviously favored by the Irish community he lived in, and even was getting into like political shit. Remember that with Governor Hartranft, right? In the 1875 elections, there was interesting intrigues around maybe, like you said, the Irish in that region voting for Democrats. There was like talk that maybe Jack Kehoe could like flip them to vote for Republicans if the Republicans were going to be better on labor issues or something along those lines. And now it gets complicated. I think it's good that you brought that up, like the Civil War stuff with like. I guess I think my original point when I sort of went off on this was when I held up this book. This is a very like pro Molly Maguire thing. I feel like it kind of sidesteps the part where they were militantly, violently opposed to like the draft for the Civil War. Yeah. Which I mean, on one level, I like you're poor, you just got here, I get it. Like, but also like beating up like black people at certain times and
this passage from like this book, The Sons of Molly Maguire, like this gives like important context because this is actually a character or like a figure in all this, Benjamin Bannon. To be fair, like he predates like a lot of like what we were focusing on when we were like dealing with this way back.
No, but I feel like we should have made him a bigger character actually because he's like the publisher of the newspaper in that area.
He was appointed to administer the draft in the Schuylkill County, and he was a radical Republican and a proud bigot with intimate ties to the coal industry. The son of a Protestant Ulsterman, he hated Irish Catholics, Democrats, and unions, and conceived a special loathing for Cass Township, where all three flourished. To Bannon, the militia draft was a handy broom for sweeping troublesome union activists and Irish Catholic Democrats from the mining villages along the West Branch into the maw of a bloody civil war, where they would have no chance to either strike or vote. With the connivance of Republican state officials, Bannon set unusually high quotas for Cass Township. At a time when soldiers in the field were denied the franchise, he then urged the draft be held before a crucial election to ensure a Republican victory. That's pretty crazy that soldiers in the field are denied the franchise to vote at that time. It's pretty interesting.
Right.
Anyway,
yeah. Sorry, go on.
Just this last paragraph. Shredding the Anthracite region's frayed social contract, the political abuse of conscription by Bannon proved a catastrophic miscalculation. For among the bulwarks of the Irish community in Schuylkill County was the Hibernian Benevolent Society, a fraternal group rooted in the Catholic secret societies of Northern Ireland, which had a long experience in fighting precisely this sort of official persecution. So that helped kind of jumpstart this entire thing. So there was some political manipulation of the draft that helped kind of rally this sentiment and this kind of partisanship of the Democrats that was a component of this as well.
Right. This became a very controversial thing in that region. They ended up having to send battalions of troops up there to kind of restore order at a point.
Yeah.
I remember they did say at one point that, I think in making that Kenny writes that actually, I didn't know this was a rule actually, because I knew that rich people, for example, the young lawyer in Pottsville at the time, Franklin B. Gowen, was able to buy himself out of the draft by, paying a poor person to take his place. That was very common and also not appreciated by the poor Irish people there. Obviously, it kind of pissed them off. But on top of that, I didn't realize this, that technically, if you were an immigrant, you weren't supposed to be eligible for the draft unless you stated a desire to become a U.S. citizen. And which is kind of funny because I feel like unless you really want to go fight in the army, just say you don't, and then after the war say, you know what I mean? It seems like it would be pretty easy to get out. I guess the idea was that, just because somebody's here temporarily, they shouldn't be forcibly conscripted unless they're on a pathway to become, and who knows, maybe it speeds up their pathway to become citizens if they go fight or something like that. But apparently Bannon and his allies, the local kind of Republican government, who were very, very anti-Irish, ignored that proviso and went into places like Cass Township, which was the one of the biggest Irish communities, and were forcibly trying to conscript people anyways who were not citizens. And so maneuvers like that really pissed a lot of people off. And so it is a complex thing because I think, in the 1870s and immediately after, when there was a high premium on demonizing the Molly Maguires, these kind of, good pro-capitalist, pro-union kind of people, these figures, including Franklin Gowen, would make big hay out of the fact that they weren't really down with the Union in the Civil War and didn't seem to care. That I have to say they don't seem to care that much about slavery either way. I don't know if it seems like their concerns were very narrowly focused on what affected their immediate region, and any imposition to go and fight or, sacrifice their livelihood, or especially also one of the complicating factors also during the Civil War in this region was that because of obviously the demand and disruptions and things like that, the price of coal shot up a lot and the demand went up by a lot. So actually laborers and miners were making much better money during the Civil War than they'd been making prior, and actually would be making after. So they were making a premium working, supplying all this coal to the Union Army, and then the draft is coming through and going to take all the men away. And, some of these men have families, they have children, etc. What are the women can't work in the mines, etc. So, you're talking about taking away their livelihood, especially at a moment when they're getting a little extra for once, and then saying, no, you have to go fight down here. And I guess the reaction, especially to the kind of rural, more recent arrivals, did seem to be kind of fuck you. But like you said, it should be mixed in with the fact that a lot of these local officials that were kind of scheming to round all of them up and send them out for their own reasons that had really nothing to do with fighting slavery and defending the Union. They had more selfish motives, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, and I think also a lot of Irish people were, this excuses it, but, they were concerned about that there would be a rush of free former slaves that would then displace them from their jobs. Again, not an excuse for any anti-black sentiment on their part, but it was driven by extreme precarity
Right. I will say that if there's one film, I know I was just ranting about how there's no Easterns. The only Eastern I think in like the big one I can sort of remember in my lifetime or even before is Gangs of New York, which
I was thinking
does
of that,
kind of
like,
trace.
That's another one of those like Irish movie, like epic Irish like shillelaghs.
It's kind of like it's a little flogging Molly-ish, but I do think it does actually portray a lot of dynamics that were really going on in like the northeastern United States in like the 1860s period, where you have like the nativist Bill the Butcher, then you have like the corrupt Irish guy who was a gangster but now he's a cop, and then you have like Tammany Hall kind of, you know, political machine using the Irish. There even are scenes in that where I have to say, like, it's probably good that Scorsese put this in here where, you know, when they start the draft riots, right, over this exact thing in 1863 in New York City, you know, at first they're burning down all the, you know, the rich guys' houses and you know, the draft offices, and you're kind of like, kick off that, play that, you know, Dropkick Murphys song. And then they just like, they start like beating up black people, you know, like free black people that are out and just like, you know, practically like lynching them. And you're like, oh, okay, that's not so cool, actually. Like that doesn't need to, you know, like they didn't do anything. Like just because they're trying to force you into the army because you're poor doesn't mean that it's like the black guy's fault for that. And so maybe a harbinger of sad race relations to come, you know, in subsequent decades, right? But nonetheless, I think like if you want like some kind of like I don't know, cinematic representation of like what because that I think that's, you know, about 5 points in New York, which is now just sort of a part of like Chinatown. It's been paved over. Doesn't really exist anymore, but it gives you the sense of how Wild West and kind of violent and crazy like big cities in the East were back then, and how there was kind of just like raw power, capitalism, all these immigrants, corrupt police, like this is America. This is the America Gustavus Myers is kind of, you know, was kind of describing. And the same is true in the 1870s. Now, the first, like he said, the first murders that would later be attributed to Molly Maguire terrorism do happen during the Civil War and, you know, are pretty much directly related, as far as we can tell, primarily to like draft related tensions and things around like Civil War related conflicts between Irish workers and
like
you know.
like James Bergen, who, you know, he was like a Union soldier. Actually, this book, again, The Sons of Molly Maguire, talks a little bit about his like background and everything. It says he was born in a period when poverty, not Britain, was a true ruler of rural Ireland. The authorities labored mightily, and with only middling success, to stem an epidemic of violence by secret peasant societies that, like the Mollies, were intent on enforcing traditional notions of the social contract. In the early 1830s, when Bergen was born, the coal fields of Queens County and County Kilkenny were beset by a secret society called the Whitefeet, which sought to improve conditions for miners and peasants. In November 1831, a band of Whitefeet clashed with the police on the border between the two counties. When several members of the group were arrested, a crowd attempted to rescue them. In the ensuing battle, between 7 and 10 people were killed, and up to 50 were wounded. For all the violence, the real horror came just as Bergen reached puberty, with the failure of the potato crop from 1845 to 1850. The Great Famine decimated agrarian Ireland. It is estimated that more than 1 million died and more than 1 million emigrated. Among the immigrants were the Bergens. Were many Bergens. Some had already made it to Pennsylvania by 1850. The census for that year shows 5 families listed variously as Bergen, Bergen with an A, and Bergen with an I, living in close proximity in the Heskerville Valley in Cass Township. At least one head of a Colecastle household, Michael Bergen with an I, had been married in Castlecomer. Up the valley in Hexsherville lived William Bergen, a native of County Kilkenny. The overlap in children's given names suggests that many of the Bergen families were related. The men were all Irish-born miners or mine laborers, and they soon learned of the dangers that smoldered deep below the surface. In June 1853, John Bergen, 16, was driving a mule in a Hexsherville mine when a fellow worker began teasing the beast. Annoyed, the boy offered some fighting words, whereupon his antagonist hit him in the forehead with a pick, killing him, according to the local paper. The attacker escaped. It is possible that the killing was not isolated. Just a month before John Bergen was killed, the newspaper reported that a James Berger had been shot in the jaw at Payne's Mines, another name for Hectorville, after an altercation with Arthur O'Neill. John Bergen's father was named James, and that newspaper sometimes rendered the family's last name with an R instead of an N, in which case the victim in the shooting might have been John Bergen's father. The motive for this violence, if it was connected, remains murky, though regional rivalries may have played a role. The Bergens were from Southern Ireland, and the mid-May shooting involved a man with a distinctly northern name, O'Neill. There was certainly tension in Cass Township between natives of the various parts of Ireland. Almost a year to the date after the O'Neill shooting, a riot erupted in Mackisburg at the western end of the Heskerville Valley between Fardowns or Ulstermen and natives of Connacht, the western Irish province, and various early accounts about the origins of the Molly Maguires, including one written by a Schuylkill County resident, speak of tensions or a feud between Kilkenny natives and those from other counties in Ireland. John Bergen's family left the area after his killing, but a second James Bergen stepped into this violent world sometime between 1850 and 1855, settling just down the road from Heskerville and Cole Castle. The village had about 70 homes in 1845, but that number swelled with the influx of famine immigrants over the next 10 years. So anyway, this different Bergen who we tracked down, he, was mustered into service on April 21st, 1861, as with Company C of the 5th Pennsylvania Infantry. He had some trouble with reaching Washington because Confederate sympathizers in Maryland were suspected of sabotaging the train tracks. But, they eventually arrived. He did miss combat on the front, but when he returned home, apparently, according to this guy's research, on December 4th, 1861, in Schuylkill County, he was in court for assault and battery with intent to kill in an incident involving John Curran. The motive for the crime is unclear. It is all but certain the defendant, James Bergen, was Private James Bergen. The names of the two witnesses in the case, William Brennan and Matthew Malley, match those of privates in Bergen's unit, Company C. Jury convicted Bergen on December 7th, but his sentence was suspended. And then, at some point, he ended up running what were they called? They're called shebeens or something.
Oh, shebeen?
Something like that, like an illegal
tavern.
Yeah, like an illegal tavern, basically.
Yeah, taverns are a big deal in this world. Like owning a tavern, they're sort of nodes of social gathering and communication and everything else.
Yeah. This is what it says about it. I'm just sorry. I was just distracted by reading a ridiculous line from Bannon's newspaper. But anyway, on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect, worsening the fears of many West Branch residents that if they were drafted, freed slaves would replace them in the mines. The very next day, Yellow Boy Bergen's luck finally ran out. It had carried him through the Great Famine, years of work in notoriously dangerous mines, and a cataclysmic civil war. It would not survive Schuylkill County politics. On Friday, January 2nd, 5 strangers entered the Bergen home asking for ale. It seems the wounded veteran and his wife had opened an unlicensed beer house, or a shebeen. Cass Township boasted scores of such establishments, and an Elizabeth Bergen stood trial in June 1863 on charges of selling liquor without a license. When Bergen told the 5 strangers there was no ale to be had, 3 drew revolvers and fired, hitting him in the abdomen. They fled, cheering for the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, an odd utterance for frustrated tipplers, but one that makes perfect sense were the victim killed because he was a two-fisted supporter of the government in an area up in arms against conscription. So, and he died in agony 3 days later. So that's technically the first, quote-unquote, Molly murder.
Oh, interesting. That's funny because Kevin Kenny does not include him in his sort of full list of Molly Maguire associated killings.
Yeah.
I think he only starts with Frank Langdon, the mine superintendent.
That's one of this guy. Who's the author of this book? Let me.
That's the one from 2014, right?
Yeah,
the newest book.
Mark Bulick. Yeah, and this book was the one that really kind of helped me hook into the story back when we were writing a script about it, because he really emphasizes the influence, the theatricality of the Mollies and their esoteric religious beliefs and their connections to Irish folk mysticism and things like that.
Right.
It's Mark Bullock, the sons of Molly Maguire. It'd be good to read later some of the stuff that he talks about in relation to that, the roots of Molly Maguireism. But part of his big intervention is that it wasn't necessarily a mine boss who was the first victim. It was actually that guy.
Yeah. Well, it's all even the mine boss being the first victim, that. It's very tenuous. These Civil War era killings are actually all very loosely. Kevin Kenny kind of divides them into like discrete periods of Molly Maguire violence, which are kind of interrupted by the kind of post-war years, like 1866. And there's a killing in 1866, and then I think not really another. It doesn't really pick up again until I know Morgan Powell, I think, is 1871. Then there's some like highway killings around maybe like Alexander Ray, for example, which were used to be like, these are, acts of the Mollies, but actually might have been more just like banditry and a couple guys just, trying to rip off the payroll of like the mining company or something like that, or like inter-gang disputes and things, not necessarily with the same intentionality as the period of like 1874, 75, when the violence really starts to escalate, right? Even though there might be some other external reasons for why that popped off so hard, given James McParland and everything. But yeah. I mean, I think just in case anybody's like curious, because I have the white boys part of Kenny's book up here, in terms of like the etymology of where Molly Maguire comes from. Again, it's kind of like, it's a little bit murky, but there's general tales that it stems from. And also the phenomenon. Really, it does come from Ireland. Though it's more complex than, say, like Franklin Gowan, allege, where like a shadowy board of Erin like sits on in some peat bog somewhere and like it says who must die in, the Shenandoah colliery or whatever. But there, a lot of this was around like agrarian violence in the 18th century, during the period of like English colonization and everything. But it wasn't always directly. It was sometimes kind of understood, maybe earlier in the 20th century, that this was kind of an importation of either like sectarian Irish Catholic fighting their Protestant oppressors and just like taking that struggle straight to Pennsylvania, or a kind of nationalist struggle of like the Irish are fighting back against, basically the British oppressors, because it's a very important thing in this conflict that the ethnic divisions in the mines themselves are basically, the Irish are at the bottom, the contract miners. Now, when we think miner, we just think of like, he's a miner, but like there's a labor division that's important here. A mine laborer is like the lowest paid, most exploited, generally unskilled class of labor in the mines. Then that's kind of like the bulk of the workers. That's what like new immigrants who didn't know any mining would come over, and they were responsible for building out the tunnels, for collecting the coal carts, and like clearing out the slag and doing all kinds of ancillary stuff. And then you'd have contract miners, usually sometimes paid by a wage, but oftentimes paid by the amount of coal they bring out. These guys are normally tended to be Welsh or English, right? Which had more developed mining regions. Occasionally they'd be Irish, often Irish Protestant, or they were Irish but had experience in England and had some like mining skills, in their background. And they generally could like make some money. They had they could kind of set their own hours. They were like contractors. Like they could go in there, kind of like lead the mining thing, and then like peace out at noon, and then all the laborers would have to like gather up all the coal and like inhale all this like toxic dust and shit until like 6 or 7 p.m. and then get paid like not nearly as much. And then so that middle strata, you have a lot of Welsh and English, and then the mine superintendents, the bosses, so to speak, are also predominantly Welsh or English and sometimes American, but very rarely Irish, and very rarely Irish Catholic. So you have that kind of division going on. So a lot of people look at it, it's just like, the Irish are banding together, and they did band together in a lot of cases. It's also important to note that like Kenny really stresses that, the idea of like Irish nationhood, right? And like, I'm Irish, like might not have been as important to people in the 1800s as I'm from Donegal, like I'm from Kilkenny and shit like that. And so he says that like, a lot of I think there was even the Sheet Iron Gang. One of the big gangs in Shenandoah was actually also Irish people, but they're mostly contract miners, and a lot of them were Protestant. And they fought viciously with the so-called Molly Maguires and with the Modocs, who were Welsh, right? Like they saw themselves as almost like, ew, like you're from Kilkenny, fuck off. Like they came from significantly different regions of Ireland that kind of had different cultures, different kind of family clan connections, right? And among the Mali sort of population, or those who were accused, like you said, the province of Connacht, or specifically County Donegal, and to a lesser extent County Mayo, that was like by far the kind of like preponderance of sort of Mali behaving individuals engaging in Maliism, right?
The boat leaves the harbor tomorrow, across the wide ocean to go. Of a kitty, my burden of sorrow is more than I'd wish you to know. There's a dark, dreary cloud hanging o'er me, and a mighty big load on my mind, as I think of the prospects before me and the country I'm leaving behind. Then farewell to the green hills of Ireland, farewell to the land I adore, and wherever I'll be I will still think of thee and the country I'm leaving behind. Oh, the kitty, please get over your crying, and don't be uneasy to me, for it's after my fortune I'm trying on the sunny shores over the sea. And each moment that passes shall find thee still reigning supreme in my mind. And your image, oh kitty, shall bind me to the country I'm leaving behind. And farewell to the green hills of Ireland, farewell to the land I adore, and wherever I'll be I will still think of thee and the country I'm leaving behind. Though the land is abounding with treasure and fair maids of every degree, my eyes may be holden with pleasure, but my heart will be longing for thee. Let the stormy clouds gather above me, and friendships grew stale and unkind. I will know there is one heart will love me in the country I'm leaving behind. Then farewell to the green hills of Ireland, farewell to the land I adore, and wherever I'll be I will still think of thee and the country I'm leaving behind.
You're going to break down a little bit of the early Irish origins, right?
Yeah, well, a lot of it, like we were talking about, like, you know, the sort of county rivalries and like the sectarian element, but like in, you know, and I think that this is partially true as it was imported to the United States as well, that a lot of it had to do with, and I mean, the relationship between the miners and the, I mean, really, they did kind of like have this type of relationship very exactly, but in Ireland, it was based on like the relationship between landlords and tenants in a big way, and it really fundamentally was like about land, both like Molly Maguireism and its antecedent, which was like you know, ribbonism.
Or white boyism.
The white boys is another name.
The white boy movement.
There were a lot of like different names they used. In fact, like before Molly Maguire, like a popular name was like Captain Rock and stuff like that. Like, yeah, like there were all sorts of like, even like the fairies was like a name that was used at one point, which kind of, you know, gets to the sort of folk roots of a lot of this stuff. And yeah, it would often be kind of like synchronized with like holiday celebrations like Samhain and Halloween, you know, which are the same thing. But yeah, like you know, St. Martin's Day, which is, you know, Samhain. Yeah, and like a different like calendar observances in the Irish calendar, and the sort of element of like dressing up like women, or what, you know, blacking the face or putting white on the face and things like that. These these like kind of extravagant costumes, like straw capes and things like that. Like this is, you know, sort of the costumes of the mummers who would be going around visiting houses, like performing like song and dance like during that time. And those customs obviously also came to the United States. But yeah, I wanted to read this manifesto, which is called The Address of Molly Maguire to Her Children. I'm not sure how like this actually came like about or was like disclosed. This guy quotes it, but he says like it was by Philip O'Reilly, and you know, it was printed as a broadsheet under the name Molly Maguire, and it landed in the hands of the magistrate in Ballinamore. It was forwarded to Dublin Castle in 1845. So it's the address of Molly Maguire to her children. Yeah, as I was saying, like, you know, I'm not going to do a little Irish voice for this, but you can probably hear in the syntax, like.
Yeah, I was going to say I might try, because the way that the coffin
all right,
notices
I'll give it. Yeah, all right.
I mean, we don't need. I practiced last night, so again, any Irish listeners, like, I'm not. I'm going to try my best to not go full Lucky Charms, and I'm not going to do all that. But I even looked up how is a Donegal, you know, accent different than a Dublin one. You know, I might not do a perfect job. I'll probably cross counties, but at least, you know, a lot of it deserves to be is best almost read, because of like the syntax and the spelling is kind of fascinating. Like it's
like I think, like, you know, use your imagination. Imagine like obviously this is written by a man, but like imagine like a high pitch, you know, because it's in the persona of Molly Maguire, you know. So imagine like, you know, you're like kind of high pitched Irish woman's voice, like, my dear children, with a heart full of sorrow, I'm a, you know.
I am obliged to give you this public warning from the numerous shabby acts it is daily committing by paltry and vile miscreants. And those acts are left in my dear children, who are as innocent of them as those unborn. And I hope I have given you better instruction than to disgrace myself and Milesian name, now in my old days. I have, thank God, learned you to bear with Christian patience your many privations more than any other children on the face of the earth. But in the end, I have a set of men called landlords, having less regard for you than for their dogs, not caring if you have enough capital D dry, capital P potatoes to eat, or a bag to cover you at night, with a heap of manure and a pig as your only property, and a drink of water your only beverage. I have lived to see you so reduced, and it is now too plain. There is no redress, for even after all the fuss about the Land Commission, it now turned out to be the greatest delusion that was ever attempted on any people. I am, my dear little ones, old enough to see Lord Stanley's humbug bill about old ditches. It now lies with yourselves, my dear children, not to starve in the midst of plenty, and to obtain that end, and to obtain your fond mother's blessing, may I beg of you, my dear children, to observe the following rules. 1. Keep strictly to the land question by allowing no landlord more than fair value for his tenure. 2. No rent to be paid until harvest. 3. No even then without an abatement, where the land is too high. 4. No undermining of tenants, nor bailiff's fees to be paid. 5. No turning out of tenants, unless 2 years' rent due before a judgment serves. 6. Assist to the utmost of your power the good landlord in getting his rents. 7. Cherish and respect the good landlord and good agent. 8. Keep from traveling by night. 9. Take no arms by day or by night from any man, as from such acts a deal of misfortune springs, having, I trust you have, more arms than you will ever have need for. Avail coming in contact with either the military or police. They are only doing what they cannot help. 11. For my sake, then, no distinction to any man on account of his religion. His acts alone you are to look to. 12. Let bygones be bygones, except in the most glaring case, but watch for the time to come. My dear children, I have laid down the above rules for your guidance, and by strictly observing, you will have the well wishes of every good man, except the heartless landlords, and by it you will be known as true sons of mine. But the wretch that will violate this, my parental command, inflicts on him a salutary chastisement. But above all, my dear little ones, the landlords that will treat those rules of mine with contempt, it grieves me to the heart to bid you commit mortal sin, but my patience is nearly worn out. But before you do so, for God's sake, and my sake, and take no life or limb without first giving the victim their written warnings, should they not be regarded. Let him that loves the danger perish in it. But I hope none will be so obstinate, for all the military or police under Her Majesty will not save the tip of the wretch, that will have no feeling for my starving children. Attend, my dear littles, to these rules of mine, and the Lord will prosper your cause, which is the prayer of your affectionate mother, Molly Maguire. Maguire's Grove, parish of Clune.
Damn.
So,
all right.
yeah.
Wow. Spitting right out the gate. Wow.
Yeah.
I love the character, like the epistolatory like character of Molly Maguire that like various people adopt. I mean, it is kind of like a Spartacus like anonymous thing, obviously, but it really does have. There's this almost mythical richness to the figure of. Speaking in adopting that voice. Not only is it excellent OPSEC, but it lends something, I don't know, grander to, and it, you know, it kind of appeals to almost a sense of like kinship ties, like like your mother, your grandmother, like a matriarch kind of thing. And it is incredible. Even this is probably the most agrarian parts of Ireland, like Connacht, Donegal, you know, right? The northwestern regions, right? Where this kind of activity, ribbon men, the white boys, Molly Maguires, it's like very acute.
Yeah.
But like I think at the end of the day, it is interesting how really what the conflict comes down to, more than a kind of an abstract thing about like they're Protestants and like we don't like them, or they're this or that,
even those
is like
rules were like,
it's about justice. It's about a sense of justice and fairness. And you can see even the way that like Molly Maguire there kind of, you know, lays it out in the letter. There's like a sense of like judiciousness to it, of like always remember to like post the coffin notice on their door first.
Yeah.
Like it's not okay to just like shoot somebody. You have to give them a fair warning that they're being unfair. And like there's kind of a process, an informal justice system, like I think what Kenny calls like an alternative informal justice system that coexists along that of, you know, the crown and the law and everything else that can take matters into its own hands and achieve like a real justice. And this is kind of all, you know, this is happening in a very obviously sort of informal, loose way, but nonetheless is like a phenomenon that, you know, is practiced at various times, like when needed. It's like something you can kind of like resort to, and it's so nebulous that it's like you can't even really pin it down. I do think it's like fascinating, kind of like the resilience of such a tactic. I think Kenny says that this was a more common thing in like situations of agrarian violence throughout Europe earlier centuries, but they had sort of mostly died out. And Ireland was one of the last places where it still kind of had a vibrant ongoing tradition. And so, and thus, like, it sort of, that's why you didn't see it as much with other, maybe the ethnic groups that came to the United States, or, you know, sort of brought this like tradition with them.
Yeah.
Right?
It's, I mean, it's interesting also that like, because I think that it would be very typical to like read this through like a pure like sectarian lens or something like that. But if you read that like document, you know, the author is like specifically saying like, you know, it's not about religion, you know, judge someone by like their actions, you know, it's not about, and like, that's not to say there wasn't sectarian violence, because there was, but it's actually trying to like tamp down on that and like, you know, try to keep that out of this movement or whatever, like this rule. So
right, because I think there was so much controversy over like the subdivision of land and kind of kicking people off their ancestral plots, or taking what is it, like Conacher, the sort of like shared grazing fields that everybody would use, like the old feudal lots used to be arranged in such a way. And they started chopping them up in ways that weren't actually like good for people and kind of immiserated them. And then I think the old absentee landlords often would like let people go years without like paying their rent. And then like these new landlords would come in and want to like kind of optimize it. You can see it as like this parable of like very early sort of capitalist development of like, you know, driving peasants off their land and dispossessing them off their land. And their natural reaction is like a fundamental violation of their sense of fairness, their like communal sense of fairness and justice, and there's no recourse for it. And so they've developed recourses for dealing with it. And, you know, and that might be killing livestock. That might be, a lot of it is, you know, property destruction at first. Like there's an escalatory sort of format to it usually, it seems, in a lot of these cases they have records of, that things would usually go from maybe warnings to then maybe they would slaughter some sheep. They'd even make it kind of look like ritualistic and scary or something like that to like freak people out. And then maybe it would go up to, you know, threatening, I'm going to fuck you up. I'm going to kill you, you know, but, you know, written very colorfully in those coffin notices. And then finally, maybe from time to time, an assassination might actually take place.
Yeah, it and obviously, you know, it like didn't always obey like those guidelines, but that, you know, is the idea expressed there. But yeah, like there's this interesting quote from like an observer of the phenomenon in 1840 in Tipperary. Well, you know, as background to this, apparently in the late 1750s, the sale of Irish beef and butter was like allowed in Britain. And so, like, that was, like, a huge change.
The importation of cows, right?
Yeah. Or, like...
or a type of cow.
Like, beef and, like, you know, cow products. Yeah.
Right.
So, like, like this observer wrote, those who have been most earnest and anxious for the improvement of their estates have come most frequently under the ban of the secret societies. Whilst the carefree spendthrift good-for-nothing landlord who hunts and shoots and drinks and runs in debt, who even exacts the most exorbitant rents from his tenants, provided not only he does not interfere with their time-honored customs of subdividing land, squatting, conacre, and reckless marriage, may live in peace. So yeah, exactly like what you're saying, like as long as they were allowed to do like conac or like however you pronounce it, squatting.
Yeah, I apologize that any of the Irish pronunciations of like Gaelic names and things like that, I'm trying to look up on Google Translate right now. Maybe there's a way to do it, but I am unfortunately truly lost in terms of like guessing pronunciation.
It's typical problem of this show. But no, like to your point about like the Molly Maguire character, like that kind of like in a way like harkens back to like, you know, this like sort of maternal like patroness. You know, like a lot of like the white boy organizations also had like a mythical woman like Lady Claire. You know,
Ghostly Sally. Yeah,
Ghostly Sally.
Actually, I just want to read this paragraph from Kenny here about the name and like what it actually is sort of supposed to represent. He says, one final intriguing question about the Irish Molly Maguires of the 1840s is the origin of their name. A number of stories were told about the name in the 19th century. One version held that an old widow called Molly Maguire had been evicted from her house and local peasants had banded together to avenge her. Another version held that Molly Maguire was the owner of the Shebeen, the illicit tavern, where the secret society met to plan its activities. According to a third version, Molly Maguire was a fierce young woman, pistols strapped to each thigh, who led bands of men throughout the countryside on their nocturnal raids. Though conveniently simple, these stories were doubtless apocryphal. They cropped up in various unconnected parts of Ireland, from Antrim to Roscommon, and they are best seen as elements of folklore rather than accurate sociological descriptions. The most plausible explanation of the name Molly Maguires is that the men who engaged in the violence disguised themselves as women. These Molly Maguires, as W. Stuart Trench observed, were generally stout, active young men dressed up in women's clothes, with faces blackened or otherwise disguised. Sometimes they wore crepe over their countenances. Sometimes they smeared themselves in the most fantastic manner with burnt cork about their eyes, mouths, and cheeks. Similar practices were common to nearly all Irish agrarian societies in the period 1760 to 1850. The White Boys, for example, were so named because they wore white linen frocks over their clothes and white bands or handkerchiefs around their hats. At the same time, they apparently pledged allegiance to a mythical woman, Ghostly Sally, whom they designated as their queen. The Molly Maguires appear to have done much the same thing. Disguised as women when they went out at night, they dedicated themselves to a mythical woman who symbolized their struggle against injustice, whether sectarian, nationalist, or economic. The clothing was not just a means of disguise. It also served to endow the agrarian agitator with legitimacy, investing him with the character of the disinterested agent of a higher authority, the, quote, son or daughter of Molly Maguire. So, I mean, it's a powerful move, and they're really like a powerful and like, I don't know, complex and sophisticated thing that was going on there.
Yeah, this is a good part that kind of like vibes with that, I wanted to read this sort of a lengthier part. Molly Maguire made her debut in the historic record in the same cold, dark season that the Mummers typically made their entrance. On December 10th, 1844, the Freeman's Journal in Dublin reported on the appearance of a group that called themselves the Molly Maguires. A fantastic name, but they assembled at night and committed outrages of every kind. About a week earlier, on December 2nd, magistrates had held a special meeting at the Ballyconnell Courthouse in County Cavan to complain of armed bodies of men marching by night, breaking open houses, dragging certain inmates out into the open air, compelling them on their knees by the terror of guns presented to their breasts to take unlawful oaths, searching for firearms when found carrying them off. The outbreak was seen as an assault on the legal system, putting a stop to the regular course of justice by making it impossible to execute court decrees. At issue was the very question of who ruled the countryside, the magistrates and constables, or armed and organized bodies of white boys. The raids on homes for arms, the assaults, and the threats became so serious that Captain John McLeod, a special magistrate from Fermanagh, was dispatched to Ballinamore, Leitrim, to deal with the outbreak. A military detachment and 36 extra constables were sent as well. The disturbances caused profound worry not only among the authorities but also among Catholic reformers. On December 22nd, Thomas Steele, a top aide to O'Connell, wrote the Emancipator from Leitrim that the Catholic clergy and supporters of the repeal movement were doing their best to counter the influence of the new organization. I have strong reason to hope that the poor, wretched, duped, and deluded Molly Maguires will, as a party, soon cease to have an existence. His hope proved premature, as police reports make clear. In one, Robert Anderson of Killishandra in County Cavan complained that on the night of January 20th, 1845, he was attending a wake at the home of Patrick Murphy near Carrigalan, less than 2 miles across the Leitrim county line, when the shout went up to "Clear the way for Molly Maguire." "Clear the way" echoed the line used for the entrance of characters in the Mummers play, and sure enough, when Molly stepped at the door, she was wearing an amalgam of Mummers or Wren boys' costumes. Her white shirt, petticoat, and hat were of the sort worn by Miss Funny or the Mary Ann character. The blackened neck and face were typical of the Fool, and the hay hoop around her waist was a nod to Jack Straw. These are characters, in the Mummers pageant that they would travel around performing. But Molly was no lady, and there was nothing playful about the violence that ensued at the Murphy home in the townland of Dumbriolanis. Anderson and John Montgomery, the only Protestants at the wake, were among 4 men viciously beaten, apparently as part of a preconcerted plan, according to a police report. The motive was listed as sectarian. A party feud is the supposed cause of the outrage. In fact, the curtain had risen on this performance months before Molly made her actual entrance. The troubles that erupted in late 1844 had been percolating since early autumn along the Cavan-Leitrim border. Conditions there were desperate a year before the potato crop failed. A priest testified before the Devon Commission in 1844 that the small tenants could not be worse off. At a time when one Leitrim farmer told the commission that at least 10 to 12 acres were the minimum needed to support a family, nearly 51% of all farms in the county covered just 1 to 5 acres. Things weren't much better in Cavan, where 42% of all farms fell into the 1 to 5 acre category. By contrast, in more prosperous County Antrim, 29% of farms were of the smallest size. Given the untenable nature of the small holdings, it should come as no surprise that the Devon Commission found that ejectment proceedings, the first step in eviction, were very common in Cavan, and that lawsuits against tenants for debt to the landlord, which could lead to imprisonment, were used extensively in Leitrim. As hard as these economic steps were for the peasantry, non-economic evictions especially rankled ribbonmen determined to protect Catholics from sectarian depredations. In Cavan, the majority of tenants who were removed from estates immediately before the famine appear to have been ejected on political or religious grounds. Matters came to a head with the close of the 1844 harvest. Starting in late September, sporadic trouble broke out in a triangle running from Ballinamore in Leitrim to Swellenbar and Bertubit in Cavan. On September 26th, a rockite notice was posted in Leganamer, Leitrim. The next night, a home was attacked just over the county line in Clarebally, Cavan. The attacks may have been pegged to the Feast of St. Michael on September 29th, when farmers traditionally killed an animal and gave portions of meat to the poor of the neighborhood, and when hunting season traditionally began. The violence grew markedly more widespread and intense in the short season of ritual bloodletting between Halloween and All Halloween, or St. Martin's Day, November 11th. On November 3rd in Cavan, threatening notices signed Captain Smart were posted at the homes of Peter Kiernan of Killywillen and John Rainbird of Newton, who had both taken holdings from which the former tenant had been evicted. A report on agrarian crimes in Leitrim between November 1st, 1844 and February 21st, 1845 shows that the first reported incident in the Mohill district was on November 4th, in the Carrick-on-Shannon district on November 8th, and the Ballinamore district on November 9th. Thereafter, trouble followed every few days. In the Ballinamore district, for example, the following incidents were reported for the month. November 12th, assault on Thomas Gukian. November 7th, attack on the home of John Gallagher and others. November 18th, threatening notice posted at the home of John and Solomon Campbell. November 20th, Arthur Nelson's home raided for weapons. November 21st, Peter and William Cannon forced to take unlawful oaths. November 22nd, Robert Ferguson's pile of turf set on fire. November 24th, homes attacked in Drumreilly Parish. November 28th, Henry Menmach and others threatened by armed man. November 28th, Pat Loughton's home raided. McLoughlin, his home was raided. By the end of the year, Leitrim ranked fourth among Ireland's 32 counties in the number of agrarian crimes, with 72, behind perennially troubled Tipperary, which had 254, Roscommon with 93, and Limerick with 73. And unlike in neighboring Roscommon, where just 9 agrarian crimes were recorded from September through December, the outrages were on the rise in Leitrim, where 41 were reported in the last 4 months of the year. By far the biggest category was threatening notices. The sheer volume of incidents made it impossible for the perpetrators to peg them to major holidays. In fact, quite the opposite occurred. After a steady drumbeat of attacks in December, the trouble mysteriously abated around New Year's. There were no incidents between December 31st and January 13th in the Ballinamore district, December 29th and January 17th in the Mohill district, and December 25th and January 20th in the Carrick-on-Shannon district. This would have been precisely the same period in which Mummer and Wrenboy groups were perambulating the countryside at night in disguises identical to those of the Mollies. At the end of January, with the mumming season behind them, the Mollies resumed their violent campaign. First, there were minor incidents like the January 20th beating of 4 men at the wake in Drumbrialis. Then, on January 29th, came the most spectacular Molly crime to date. 2 gunmen, waiting at the gate to a manor, Garadice Lodge in Leitrim, assassinated Captain MacLeod, the special magistrate from Fermanagh, who had been dispatched to Ballinamore to deal with the outbreak. The killing came 2 days before the eve of Brigid, but perhaps as interesting as the timing was the locale. The manor sat beside Garadice Loch, not far from Mag Slech, the old stomping ground of that bloody idol Crom Cruach. Thus, the first Molly Maguire killing took place within a couple of miles of the site in Ireland most closely linked to human sacrifice, a couple of days before a holiday with deep pagan roots. In part, the killing was an act of propaganda designed to make people take notice, and if the timing and locale sent a message to the peasantry that was lost in the landlords, so much the better. The message the landlords received was loud and clear anyway. You will readily perceive this is no ordinary murder, that it has been committed with a degree of audacity which is quite astonishing, wrote William Sidney Clements, the future Lord Leitrim, who was himself killed by secret society gunmen 33 years later.
Oh my God. 33 years later? No.
Yeah.
Wow.
The local aristocrats were not the only ones to take notice. The MacLeod killing inspired Anthony Trollope, then working as a postal clerk in Ireland, to write the first of his many novels. He finished The McDermonts of Ballycloran in July 1845, 6 months after Captain MacLeod was slain. The book centered on the killing of a Leitrim magistrate, Captain Usher, at the gates of an estate. And, then talks a little bit about the ballad of Molly Maguire they wrote afterwards, I think we might have worked that into one draft of the script that we wrote, right? There was MacLeod so big and proud, I think it fit to mention, to put men in jail and take no bail, it was his whole intention. To liberty, as you may see, some persons did inspire, to lay him down, the dirty hound, they say it was Molly Maguire.
Ooh, nice. There's a lot of good Molly Maguire songs.
Yeah,
there's a lot of good dedications there. Yeah. And Leitrim is one of the places also that this region, not long after that period you just described, get pretty hard hit by the potato famine and lose a lot of population.
Yeah.
Right. I think, about 30% of the total population between 1841 and 51. So actually kind of during this decade when that happened. That's also the significant backdrop to this, right? There are also developments, I guess, in Donegal from the mechanization and contraction of the linen industry, but they only lost 14% of their population. But another interesting thing about that region was its proximity to Irish Protestants. Like they had much more proximity or a mixed population between Catholics and Protestants than other parts of Ireland. And Kenny says that the uneasy coexistence of relatively large numbers of each group in Cavan, Monaghan, and Donegal heightened rather than diminished religious hatreds, lending a significant sectarian twist to Molly Maguireism. This is all the more clear given the preponderance of Protestants among the ranks of landlords, agents, and authority figures in Ireland, and among mine superintendents and skilled miners in Pennsylvania. The latter group was dominated by the Welsh, who were notorious for their contempt for Irish Catholics on both sides of the Atlantic. In Pennsylvania, that contempt was expressed by the Welsh and reciprocated by the Molly Maguires in the form of violence. So yeah, Kenny says that this sectarian element is important in understanding the disproportionately large number of Molly Maguires who came from County Donegal. In no other county in Ireland did an impoverished Irish-speaking peasantry live in such close proximity to large numbers of Protestants, many of whom were organized in Orange Lodges. The prevalence of seasonal migration from the county meant that many of its men had experience working for Protestant employers in Ulster's Lagan Valley, East Donegal, in East Ulster, and especially in Scotland. All three places were marked by a particularly virulent form of anti-Catholicism in the mid-19th century, and it's likely that many emigrants from Donegal carried with them to the U.S. bitter memories of religious discrimination in Ulster and Britain. As a result, they were particularly predisposed, fuck that word, to interpret economic exploitation in sectarian terms. This predisposition hardened in Pennsylvania when they found themselves laboring for skilled Welsh miners and native-born Protestant mine owners, and were the targets of venomous attack by the fiercely anti-Catholic nativist press, basically Benjamin Bannon, chief among them. Here's an example of that. Way back in 1845, in Ireland, a newspaper in County Roscommon printed a copy of the following threatening letter. I'll try to sound Irish here. It's okay. Turk Dixon, we, the undersigned, as head and representatives of the society called the Molly's Men, having heard so many valid witnesses against you, as a damned orange rascal, an undermining rogue, a two-faced false villain, a backbiting infernal blackguard, not content with stealing your neighbor's goods, you then proceed to undermine them and get their land. We give you this as the first and last notice, to give up this farm to its proper owner. Yeah, that's actually a pretty chill one. Yeah. Sorry, that sounded a little Scottish. Anyways.
Channeling Sean Connery.
I know. The Sean Connery fucked me up. We were talking about that earlier, the Molly Maguire movie. We haven't talked... no, it's a good movie overall, but it has some things that I wish it would have done better. The Irish accents would have been a nice touch. Sean Connery sort of doesn't modify his Scottish brogue.
It's weird that Sean Connery has played Irish men so many times, when he apparently can't really do... But I don't know. Maybe there's some Irish people who sound kind of like Sean Connery. I don't know.
There could be some regional accents that do sound... I think especially like Ulster, like Belfast, I think in the north, there's a lot there's a stronger overlap, but there's that kind of like more guttural. That's more Scottish. It's kind of like voice. I feel like I'm being offensive, but I think that I'm Scottish.
Well, I mean, given how much consideration we've shown to French people, or I've shown to French people in this podcast,
it's okay. They can handle it. They can handle it. But also, he also points out, obviously, that in remote areas like West Donegal, there was a lot of syncretic formal Catholic beliefs, merged with folk custom and popular magic. He says that they're not in any way pre-Catholic or non-Catholic. They doubtless regarded themselves as devoutly Catholic, even if their version of the religion differed markedly from that of the metropolitan hierarchy. So yeah, I think that kind of presages that there would be kind of significant conflict between the Catholic Church, both in Ireland and in Pennsylvania, and the sort of type of spiritual practices that the Molly Maguires sort of get up to. Though I think it's like fair to point out that I don't think they saw themselves as not Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. Like the kind of people that were engaging maybe in these folk practices and swearing oath. I don't think that most of these like Molly Maguire individuals, and definitely not the Ancient Order of Hibernian members, which is another group we've yet to like kind of break down. But I certainly don't think that they kind of saw themselves as like, you know, cheating on their Catholic vows. I think they saw themselves as totally compliant. But there was controversy.
A great example
over this,
because like being a member of secret society is like anathema to like the church. Like you're not supposed to be a member of a secret society. I think mostly because of like concerns about masonry.
Right.
So what some of these groups would do is like they would have their vows like last for a certain period of time, like 3 months, and expire like on Saturday at midnight. So then when they would like confess to a priest, they would be able to like say, you know, honestly that they're not a member of a secret society, and then like, you know, retake their vows to be a member of a secret society like immediately afterwards.
That's funny. That's funny.
Yeah.
That is funny. I wonder how seriously people do that. I know eventually, you know, there are groups like the Knights of Columbus that got formed, which I felt like served very much a kind of social function for American Catholics to have something like Freemasonry, but they weren't allowed, obviously, by the Vatican. You know, you could be a up-and-coming Catholic American who wants to get in with the, you know, the city fathers and stuff like that, but like you can't join the Freemasonic Lodge because you're Catholic. So then, you know, I think they decided, well, Catholics can have their own thing, and we'll just call it the Knights of Columbus, and it'll be like a charity organization, even though it's called Knights of. You know, it's like you're not technically taking an oath because it's Catholic. It's a little ambiguous. I feel like the AOH was, well, it was a little more similar actually to like the Odd Fellows or something like that, where it was, you know, like a secret fraternal group, and that led people like the Bishop of Philadelphia, James Frederick Wood, to like condemn it very strongly, just whole cloth. But other people, I think the Bishop in Pittsburgh actually endorsed the AOH, and then the bishop in Scranton in the north of the coal country kind of took like a hands off of like refused to condemn them, but like kind of didn't do anything about it. Didn't really want to address it because obviously a lot of the flock were probably involved in it. But that was the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which started I think in New York, right, in maybe the 1820s, in an earlier wave of kind of extreme nativist reaction to Irish immigrants. That started and then eventually spread back to Ireland and spread to other cities around the United States, and would become like a central boogeyman of the sort of the case against the Molly Maguires. And there would be like a lot of bullshit, a lot of like disinfo to conflate the AOH with the Molly Maguires, and then also with another thing we haven't talked about, America's first successful labor union. Makes a big cameo in this story, right? Mm-hmm. We haven't even gotten there, but I mean, there's so many interesting layers, and also with a kind of like interesting Irish origin for Mr. John Siney, the idealistic labor activist, right? Mm-hmm. Who starts the Working Men's Benevolent Association after the Civil War, I believe in 1868 in Schuylkill County. But this region, you know, is not just where Molly Maguireism popped off, but also like simultaneously is where I think there were attempts to make some kind of labor union here or there, obviously before 1868, but the first one that sort of stuck for a brief period of time, right, was the Working Men's Benevolent Association, and it's like rise and fall matches that of the Molly Maguires, though that's not to say that they're the same thing, because I think when some of these later scholars get into it, what you realize is that they absolutely weren't, though at the time, according to Benjamin Bannon, the newspapers, Franklin Gowen, etc., these things were all jumbled together into like one big scary, like leftist, Antifa, Irish, Catholic, like pagan, weird fucking plot to overthrow like WASP democracy. Like basically that's how it all got kind of hyped up in this really hysterical way. It's honestly, it's like a masterclass in sort of early American media, like manipulation, and seeing, even though, you know, this is still pre-radio and stuff, but they did have telegraph agencies. And because the railroads, which in a way were, I told you, like my little comparison, even going back to the 2010s, was like the railroads are like the internet. Whoa, like they're kind of, they just speed everything up, and everything can go everywhere faster. Information can travel faster. People can travel faster and stuff. So as any Drumpf watcher can tell you these days, disinfo travels faster too, right?
Yeah.
And we see like a crazy billionaire, really a millionaire, but by today's inflation standards, a billionaire who's kind of on one, spreading all kinds of lies, and you could say conspiracy theories, right, about entire ethnic groups of people to further his goals of like power and domination and capital accumulation. It's all happening with all this stuff. Anyways.
Yeah, and actually, just like a slight correction, it was like the 1830s. In 1833, that the Ancient Order of Hibernians was incorporated as Pottsville's Hibernia Benevolent Institution. Yeah.
Okay.
There had been a St. Patrick's Society that is active in Pottsville earlier.
Okay.
Yeah. But
was that the first branch ever, or was there was that just the founding of the Pottsville, Pennsylvania branch? Did it start in New York initially, or did it start in Schuylkill County?
I think it started there. I think like there were like ribbon organizations, like obviously in Ireland, like before that. The Schuylkill County Hibernians united with other former rivermen in New York City in 1836. So
okay.
Yeah. So the new national group, you had a charter from a ribbon society in Ireland. But yeah, so they both had like their antecedents. They both had their roots in the ribbon societies in Ireland. But they were kind of founded around the same time, and they incorporated together in 1836.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was during a time where that was like kind of a real Nina period.
Yeah. I was looking up, like, I don't know, like, what is even the best part of this to read, but I was reading this thing, like, it's called A Plea for the West. It was written by Reverend Lyman Beecher. Who's like, like a nativist screed, basically. I'll just read the beginning. Like, ever since the era of modern missions, skeptical men have ridiculed the efforts of the church to evangelize the world and predicted their failure. What, say they, do these Jews build? If a fox do but go up upon the wall, it will fall. The world can never be converted to Christianity by the power of man. And full well do we know it, and most deeply do we feel it, and in all our supplications for aid, most emphatically do we confess our utter impotency. And could no power but the power of man be enlisted, it would be indeed of all experiments the most ridiculous and hopeless. But because man cannot convert the world to Christianity, cannot God do it? Has he not promised to do it, and selected his instruments, and commanded his people to be fellow workers with him? And hath he said, and shall he not do it? Instead of being a work of difficulty and dilatory movement, when the time to favor Zion comes, it shall outrun all past analogies of moral causes, as if seed time and harvest should meet in the same field, or a nation should instantly rush up from barbarism to civilization. This is all very weirdly prescient of a totally different situation, but anyway, but as all great eras of prosperity to the church have been aided by the civil condition of the world and accomplished by the regular operation of moral causes, I consider the text as a prediction of the rapid and universal extension of civil and religious liberty, introductory to the triumphs of universal Christianity. It is certain that the glorious things spoken of the church and of the world as affected by her prosperity cannot come to pass under the existing civil organization of the nations. Such a state of society as is predicted to pervade the earth cannot exist under an arbitrary despotism and the predominance of feudal institutions and usages. Of course, it is predicted that revolutions and distress of nations will precede the introduction of the peaceful reign of Jesus Christ on earth. The mountain shall be cast down, and the valley shall be exalted, and she shall overturn and overturn and overturn till he whose right it is shall reign, the King of nations, the King of saints. And, he goes on later. It is the testimony of American travelers of the territorial, civil, and ecclesiastical statistics of our country, and the action and bearing of political causes upon our institutions are more familiar at Rome and Vienna than with us, and that tracts and maps are in circulation, explanatory of the capacious West, and pointing out the most fertile soils in the most favored locations, and inviting to emigration. These means of a stimulated expatriation are corroborated by the copious and rapidly increasing correspondence of those who have already arrived, and the increasing facilities of transportation. But if, upon examination, it should appear that 3/4 of the foreign emigrants whose accumulating tide is rolling in upon us are, through the medium of their religion and priesthood, as entirely accessible to the control of the potentates of Europe as if they were an army of soldiers enlisted and officered and spreading over the land, then indeed we should have just occasion to apprehend danger to our liberties. It would be the union of church and state in the midst of us, the church and the state both in Europe and the pliant colonial church here. Her priesthood educated under the despotic governments of Catholic Europe, and dependent for their office, support, and honors upon a foreign temporal prince, on whose sanction to their laws and doings they are as dependent as the colonies were upon George III. And this prince, too, elected by Austrian influence and sustained by Austrian bayonets, and of course subservient to Austrian policy. And he goes on about the Pope being the creature of Austria.
That was a kind of a common thing, right? Was that somehow like Catholic? Did we discover that in like World War One, reading about World War One or something, that like Catholics were suspected of being like pro-Austrian or somehow controlled by like the Archduke, of Austria for some reason. I mean, I guess they are like the most powerful Catholic monarchs, but or maybe it was Samuel Morse, who's freaked out about Austrian influence. There's a lot going on, I think, in the 1830s.
Samuel Morse also was like a hysterical anti-Catholic, like apparently.
Right.
He also like published like a weird tract. Oh yeah, we talked about Samuel Morse.
Yeah, his crazy trip to the Vatican. I think that might have been in History of the Great American Fortunes. Maybe we dug that up.
Probably,
I went down an interesting rabbit hole where he had a distant like cousin, Samuel F.B. Morse, who I believe became like a developer, I think, of Pebble Beach and like Monterey Bay and stuff like that in like early California. But he was closely associated with a descendant of the Heckshells. Is that their name, right? Who were like a New York Dutch family that pop up in Schuylkill County as like major mine developers and like landowners that just like pop over because they sound like fucking ex-patroons to me, based on that Dutch ass name, right? But like if you look through like Heckshells, I think like they're one of those families that is just like spread out throughout like American history and always pops up in some kind of advantageous position. Even out in like Carmel in the 20th century. But I think they went to either Yale or Harvard together. Samuel F.B. Morse and one of these like descendant Heckshells of the ones that own mines kind of during this period, I think in Pennsylvania. But anyways, that was a fun little side quest.
It is notorious that the Catholic immigrants of this country are generally of the class least enlightened and most implicit in their religious subjection to the priesthood, who are able, by their spiritual ascendancy, to direct easily and infallibly the exercise of their civil rights and political action. And it were easy to show, were this the time and place, that they do interfere in the exaction of fees, in the control of children, and in the article of marriage, as no Protestant minister ever did or would dare to attempt, and that a secular influence is beginning to be exerted over the political action of their dependent, confiding people.
Wow.
And is there no danger from a population of nearly 1 million augmenting at the rate of 200,000 or 300,000 a year by immigration, whose physical power and property and vote are, as entirely as in Europe, within the reach of clerical influence?
It's the Great Replacement Theory, like 1.0, Tucker's family's been saying this for hundreds of years. Okay,
I'm thinking like about just today on the benighted and cursed platform X, which I have yet proven unable to extricate myself from as much as I desperately wish to. I was seeing people talking about how, as we record this episode, we're in the midst of the Mahmoud Khalil story. This guy who is like a leader in the pro-Palestine movement on Columbia's campus, and like basically, even though he's a green card holder, he may be deported from the United States simply for opposing a genocide. Like I was seeing today on X, people saying that Mahmoud Khalil is like a British intelligence agent. First of all, like what? Second of all, like it's the same type of thing where it's like this. I mean, I guess the obvious thing is that like he's in Hamas, which I think is probably a more normal belief.
What's the rationale
as far
for him
as
being a
things go.
British intelligence agent?
I think because he worked like for like some British like government sponsored NGO at something at some point. Like he had previously like worked on some kind of like some NGO that had to do with Syria or something, or with Lebanon. I don't recall.
Right.
But he had lived in the UK. Yeah.
What are they getting at by like? What are they implying by saying that he's a British spy? By getting arrested, they wanted him to
they're
get
saying that we
arrested?
need to arrest him.
They're standing up to him because he's an infiltrator from Britain.
Yeah, it's so bizarre,
Okay.
like that, like, you know, to say that like Britain is trying to subvert the United States like through this agent. Like it kind of doesn't like it's like, wait a minute, Britain is trying to subvert the US, like, you know, a country that's been like in lockstep with us like for, you know, basically the lifetime of anyone living.
It's an 1870s flashback.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess that is the idea, that like they are against us and he's an agent of the British government to bring us down, I guess.
But Britain like is totally behind Israel.
Well, no. I don't know what to tell you.
Why are they doing that? Okay.
Yeah, he was extensively vetted. He worked at the embassy in Beirut, the British embassy in Beirut. There you go.
All right, Beirut. I mean, come on. Like, yeah, like they gotta do better than that. That's all they got.
Also, like, what the fuck? It doesn't make any sense. But the point is that, like, it's, you know, like a vector, like just someone who like simply lives here, and I guess expresses certain views, which are completely reasonable, and that most Americans at this point share. Like, is like a foreign agent or something. Like, and yeah, it's not enough to say. Yeah, I guess I don't know. Maybe what reminds me
the scapegoat mechanism, the sort of, you know, the outsider. The foreign agitator scapegoat mechanism is alive and well.
Yeah,
you know,
maybe
you could see it here, and you could see it today, just as it was back
maybe
in the 1870s.
What causes me to you know, connect that particularly with this is like the idea that, like, you know, I mean, obviously it's one thing, which obviously I also disagree with, to say like, oh, immigrants are like degrading our culture in some way, but like that's not enough. They have to be like the pawns of some kind of European enemy. Like they have to be like the tool of Austria. So like, you know, like some like cleverer force is like using them, you know. Like,
no, 100%.
They're
100%.
just like riffraff, but like a worthy adversary in Europe is like using them to try to destroy us. Yeah.
Well, you know, as Zelensky said, you have big ocean between you, so we can, you know, it can get a little delusional sometimes. And, you know, it's like the abstract fear of like some kind of shadowy thing being plotted over in Europe can kind of sell because it's like far enough away, especially back then when it's harder to, you know, it takes a lot.
I feel like
time to go there, and most people won't.
I'll try to connect this to the Molly Maguires and not go off like on a tangent, but it is like it's bizarre how, and I guess it does relate because it's similar. Like, you know, it's not really too profound or insightful of a point, but I feel like we're really seeing like the metastasis of this like vulgar conspiratorial like content where like it's become like it's more than like a subculture or more than like a style of thought or something. It's like almost like a vernacular where like, or a shibboleth where everything has to be framed like, or a way of performing authority or something, where everything has to be framed as some kind of like psyop or like intelligence operation. Not to like criticize people without looking at the beam of my own eye here, or to in any way say that it's not good to you know, look into psyops or intelligence.
No, I know you mean like
shoot myself on the foot there, but yeah, like you do.
Like the performatively like ascribing to sort of like every news item like some kind of like thing, like some kind of interpretation. You know, a kind of conspiratorial kind of
it's
interpretation
I feel like,
of it that totally supports like your view. Like,
exactly,
that,
it's
you
like
know, like buttresses your view.
Or it's like, you know, it's like to have a hook,
almost
like
as you, like just not even because it's right, but just to be like as a power flex to be like, I'm asserting my reality on this situation. Like at every given opportunity, like it's like Elon quote tweeting something and just being like concerning. You know, or you know, some shit like that, or you know, reposting some stupid meme, or you know, calling something a psyop, like when it's like not even, you know, just saying something dumb, but like he gets to, I don't know, violate the epistemic authority of like the libtards, whatever libtard institution is saying something. No, maybe I'm not expressing it super clearly, but I feel like I know what you mean.
Yeah, well, I feel like, you know, and I mean, as someone who is like, you know, somewhat pigeonholed in the like parapolitics, and I say that in SpongeBob font, you know, space, like you know, like it's irritating to me how I almost feel like it is a, you know, like much of it is just like untrue and like nakedly so. And I think that a lot of the people who are saying it, whether because they are just like grifters or because like they're actually like nefarious actors in some way, I don't know, you know, not to turn it around on them, but like I think it's almost like it's become like a style of performing authority. Like you can't just like be racist, like, you know, in order to make your racism like have this aura of like authority and credibility, like in this kind of like discourse, it has to be like conspiratorial somehow. You know what I mean? Like it's not like enough like that, like is what like people like value that so much, like the idea that like, oh, there's some like secret angle to this.
It is kind of the pan red pill sort of like everything is like a red pilling experience. Like let me red pill. It's like let me red pill you on and then like fill in the blank. It could be a bunch of different. It's not strictly about like men are actually oppressed or something, or it's not just about like Trump is actually you could slot in a variety of, or it could mean, you know, sort of the whole panoply of things, or it could mean literally like hard Nazism, or it could, you know what I mean? Like, but it's the act of the red pilling, like the reveal, the constant reveal of like,
bro, do you know about like the like bloopity bloop? You know, it's like, what's that? It's like, it was a secret plan that was undertaken on Jekyll Island by every businessman in the world, like with like 500 Jews, and they all decided like that they need to like put yellow, honestly, like.
It's honestly, it's really annoying. Yeah, like any kind of pretension to like, oh, I read something and like I'm gonna try to. I care about getting the information. I'm conveying, like, I care about getting it right. It's kind of completely at the window with a lot of these mega influencers that are rising, even in the sort of like conspiracy space. I think there's some new hotshots that, you know, go from zero to Rogan overnight.
Well, I know exactly who you're talking about. It. He's the absolute poster child of this. He's the absolute poster child of like, have you heard about like the gloopity plan? It's like, oh, bro, what's that? It's like, well, it was a secret plan to like make us all eat not beef tallow, and then you know, and like it's totally the Mossad, and it's like, you know, it's like, yeah, I mean, I it's like a knife in my heart like a lot of the time because like I'm like, you know, again, like I'm sympathetic to like the like SpongeBob font parapolitical lens, like, or, you know, the critical paranoid approach, but like the critical is key there. Where like, and I feel like that ultimately is not like, but that's like not what, and this is true like in the Maguire context, in a way it almost links back to like our script about this, where like nuance and like complexity does not have an audience.
No,
like,
because you know what, it's about power. It's about the monopoly. It's what the original title of the script was, which was, I think, a twist on, you know, Weber's maxim, a monopoly of violence, you know, rather than a monopoly on violence. But it's about kind of like, it is about power and just like asserting your power over like the opposing force, and like fuck any other, you know, consideration. You could kind of see it with, you know, like the way that history was like being twisted in real time by the interests of like the Reading Railroad and Franklin Gowen and all of his minions and hirelings and shit, and, you know, Benjamin Bannon, the sort of like neurotic old school Whig. He really was a Whig, honestly. We say he's Republican, but like we forget, you know, like he was an old school Whig who then was homeless. He loved Henry Clay. He had like a weird grab bag of things. He was like against alcohol prohibition, also against women's suffrage, very pro-abolition, hated Irish Catholics. So like, you know what I mean? Just like a fucking weird grab bag of 19th century American political stances that somehow made sense. What really, though, it's interesting that it seemed like he had a really genuinely felt like anxiety from the point of view of his kind of Protestant work ethic view of like what the American economy and like American society was supposed to be. He really was a kind of like small businessman, you know, self-sufficient, like small operator businessman idealist in many ways. And he would be actually brutally disabused of that by like the mid 1870s, though he never stopped blaming, you know, the Molly Maguires in his newspaper. But Ketty said while it would be simplistic to dismiss Bannon's anti-Catholicism as nothing other than a front for economic concerns, there can be no doubt that the targets he chose on the Irish, drunkenness, ignorance, laziness, moral laxity, idolatry, political indoctrination, were relevant not only to the production of a responsible citizenry, but also to the production of a responsible, self-sufficient workforce. The Protestant notions of a, quote, calling, of, quote, worldly asceticism, and of the modest accumulation of wealth as a sign of grace were powerful moral sanctions in producing qualities opposite to those Bannon found most reprehensible in Irish Catholics. Self-discipline, sobriety, and punctuality were not only religious obligations, but social norms in an expanding capitalist society. This emphasis on economic self-sufficiency helps to explain why Bannon attacked only Irish Catholic immigrants and not immigrants and Catholics in general. Germans, whether they were Catholic or Protestant, were only attacked on the issue of liquor, and even then only very rarely. Catholicism in its Irish variety was the primary target of Bannon's nativism, but the ultimate source of his hostility to the Irish was the stubborn fact that so many of them worked as laborers rather than miners when they arrived in the Anthracite region, and continued to do so for the rest of their working lives. The ethnic and religious divisions between British and Irish residents of the Anthracite region corresponded to rigid social divisions in the mines and mining towns. The variety of cultural attributes that Bannon lamented in the Irish masked a very real fear that a class of immigrants had arrived who were unwilling or unable to move upward through the social scale. It was this material threat to Bannon's cherished polity of small, upwardly mobile producers that underlaid the objections he raised against the Irish throughout the 1850s, their drunkenness and general waywardness, their poverty and laziness, their criminality and insanity, their undemocratic religion, and their perverse insistence on taking the wrong side in the great moral crusades of the day, including Sabbatarianism, temperance, educational reform, and anti-slavery. Yeah, I guess fair the anti-slavery a little bit, but then, you know, having read Gustavus Myers, we know like we know the fate of the small producers and operators. Like they will be crushed eventually by the large combines and the corporations, right?
Yeah, this is similar too. There's actually a great, like, you know, I think like Kenny and Mark Bulick like are very much like aligned, and really like the Sons of Molly Maguire is like kind of an expansion of Kenny's like project in making sense of the Molly Maguires, because he has a great passage about Bannon that's similar. So he does note that like Bannon's interest in immigration was natural for the son of a naturalized Ulsterman, but it was also at least partly commercial. Some of his book advertisements were directed at the largely immigrant Catholic population, and by the 1840s, he was an agent for those who wanted to pay the passage to America for friends and relatives in Ireland, or who wanted to send money home. The swelling ranks of Irish Catholic workers in Schuylkill County meant not only labor for the mines, but also money in Bannon's pocket. The money Bannon made from immigrants didn't stop him from gradually developing a hatred for Irish Catholics as virulent as any in his father's native Belfast. But Bannon's was no simple-minded sectarianism. He came to hate the Irish Catholic mine workers of the Anthracite region because of the challenge they posed to his worldview. Bannon, like many mine operators in the Schuylkill County coalfield, espouse a virtual theology that linked free enterprise by small businessmen to industrial efficiency, economic growth, the Protestant work ethic, and the future of American democracy, as embodied first by the Whigs and later by the Republicans. It's like, I'm just
honestly,
cracking up because it's like so...
This is that real WASP shit. Like, this is what we talk about. Like,
and it's a curse on this nation, like, to this day.
It's
like,
so bad. It's not acknowledged. It's not acknowledged that like business is their religion. Like there's not a difference, but like it is their fucking religion. They are like the Jesuit order of the Silk Toppers are like the Jesuit order of like Protestant capitalism. You know what I mean? Like like they'll.
Yeah, he says, add equal measures of temperance, abolitionism, and evangelical fervor, and you have the antithesis of everything the typical Irish immigrant to the country held dear. The recognition that Bannon himself had helped populate the coal region with a people whose worldview so utterly contradicted his own may only have further embittered him. That a deep antipathy toward Irish Catholics was not the inevitable product of an Ulster Protestant heritage. This is actually, it actually pivots here to talk about the Goins a little bit.
Very similar a profile, right?
Well, like he actually draws a contrast because James Goin, the father of Franklin Goin.
Oh yeah.
He was raised in Newton Stewart, County Tyrone, and attended the Academy of Strabane. Then he worked as a teacher for a time before immigrating to Philadelphia in 1811. Mm-hmm. There, he played a leading role in the Hibernian Society for the Relief of Immigrants from Ireland, which helped many a Catholic and was not related to the Neo-Ribbon Hibernia benevolent institution. Mm-hmm. Though an ardent Episcopalian, he strongly supported religious tolerance and even sent his two oldest sons to a Catholic school in Emmitsburg, Maryland. His support for the Democratic Party during the Civil War was so strong that some neighbors suspected him of treason. But there can be no doubt of the degree to which Goin embraced his new country. He named the third of his 5 sons Franklin Benjamin Goin, and the last George Washington Goin. Franklin and George were close. The former, born in 1836, was apprenticed to a Lancaster merchant after attending an elite school in nearby Lititz. He frequently visited George, who also attended the school, until in 1852 he moved to Shamokin, a coal town in Northumberland County, to manage an iron furnace for the merchant. By 1858, he and a partner, J.G. Turner, who were operating a colliery in Mount Lafitte. Franklin brought in his brother George to work as a company bookkeeper, but the mine failed the following year, and the older Goin began to study law. He was admitted to the county bar in 1860 and became active in Democratic politics. The Civil War divided the family to some degree. Because his father's deep suspicions about the conflict, despite his father's deep suspicions of the conflict, George Goin enlisted in the 48th Pennsylvania Volunteers and rose to colonel before being killed just days before Lee surrendered at Appomattox.
That's right. Franklin, I forgot his brother. Yeah. His brother, the great Civil War hero, dies like a week before the war ends. It sucks.
Yeah.
But and his psychotic Protestant Irish father who made a pretty good living for himself. But I remember we wanted to sort of really involve him and of course Franklin Goin as characters. That's something, if I had one critique about the 1970 film, though I think its politics and lens are overall quite good, it features or even talks about Franklin Goin. And there is such a richness of character there. And honestly, you can't really understand the whole story without understanding what Franklin Goin was doing with the Reading Railroad, and also where he came from and why he eventually became so fixated and obsessed with taking down the Molly Maguires, arguably to a point that did not help him materially, right? That was a fascinating thing about reading his story and kind of matching it up with that of the Mollies is he ultimately, spoiler alert, he ultimately quote unquote wins. He defeats them. He defeats kind of everybody in the 1870s, in the Union, the operators, everybody. He's on his way to becoming, we should stress, a Rockefeller, a Carnegie, a Morgan, right? He's considered heckin' Elon Musk of the 1870s. This guy's a freaking genius. You don't even get it. He would give speeches, at the Philadelphia Opera House, TED Talks about,
he was kind of like Vivek Ramaswamy, actually.
He was no, he was an ultimate,
really eloquent,
businessman.
Yeah.
And it really embodied this like Protestant capitalist idea of like his religion was the rationalization of of business process and like markets, and like and somehow, some way, it was going to lead to like greatness and abundance for everybody, definitely for him, but also for everybody eventually, and blah blah blah. And anybody getting in his way was kind of standing in the way of God's plan, but also in a very kind of early modernist, like rationalist kind of way. And he's there's a lot of slick talkers in this story. Franklin Goen is an extremely slick orator, and he is a trained lawyer, but this guy is like a slippery eel, and also had a certain riz to him in this period where it felt like this guy's like a man of the future. Like, I think he made people believe that he would be what I think like J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller eventually became, which was these kind of, organizers of like, these like vertically integrated systems of corporations that all like fed into each other and were all controlled by interlocking, boards of directors. And what we saw in like the very early 20th century, right? Before like antitrust laws, got passed. I mean, this is even before, the Sherman Antitrust Act has not come around yet. So this is really like the Wild West era where a lot of these like future Gilded Age robber barons and silk toppers are like, they're making their ill-gotten fortune. This is like his, and he would be up there in the hot gaff, pantheon of sickos. But partially this specific struggle of the 1870s with the Molly Maguires, like it arguably deranges. Like, he's lying and he knows he's lying, obviously, I think, throughout a lot of this. That's at least my read on it. At the same time, I think there's like a level of like genuine psychosis and even maybe like a weird kind of self-hating identity thing going in, because he is at least half Irish, though Protestant, but like still, he's not like a pure WASP, like the first families, like, he's not like J.P. Morgan, right?
Yeah.
His grandfather found Etna, so like
he's not even really a WASP because they're Irish.
But he is actually half Pennsylvania Dutch. His mother was Pennsylvania Dutch, so kind of that's a WASP,
He's
but
got a strain,
but not like a high not like a New England like Mayflower merchant family or a Southern slaveholding family, etc. Like a little more actually like a Carnegie, like a a penniless Scottish boy who came over. That his father was like that, just like a young whippersnapper who came over here and was very industrious and acquisitive and built themselves up into a thing. And then Franklin kind of, springboarded off his dad's decent success, and then just went ham when he finally got in charge of the Reading Railroad. Yeah, his mental health suffers, I think, though maybe that's understandable given how, like, it's almost comical how personally he throws himself into like all of this, to the point where he like appoints himself to be the lead prosecutor at the Molly Maguire trials, so he can give like monologues in court and like have all the newspapers write them down and like literally shape, like he literally ends up leading the legal prosecution against his enemies eventually. But even to get there, there's a lot of shit that happens even before that. Anyways, so let's see. Franklin Goen is sus.
Yeah.
He's very sus. He should be in HotCaf, but he doesn't, and we will reveal the reason why probably in the second part of this. Let's see. So we've covered a lot. We've covered a lot of the preparatory ground. I think we have a little time left here of like the preliminary conditions of where this like Molly Maguire phenomenon and network sort of blew up in the coal mining region.
Need another one because like we haven't really gotten into like what actually happened.
No, we've been very mysterious, but I'd say go watch the movie. But the movie is not literally not accurate in terms of like it does a movie thing and it can. We did that too, to be fair.
Well,
like we compressed
that was,
a couple
part
of
of like
things.
why I feel like it kind of like deteriorated and like I was saying, it kind of like ballooned into like being SJ because like it's just not like a satisfactory like form in which to like take on something like this. Not to say that, like, this is the perfect Molly Maguire podcast that will eventually be realized in the next episode. But, like, I feel like the whole problem that we had to have, like, this guy, like, we were, like, stuck with this guy, like, McParlin as being, like, the protagonist. Like, I feel like when we stopped talking about it, like, and we pivoted to, like, doing the podcast, like, that was, like, something that we were, like, playing around with, like, changing, even though we probably, like, this never would have gotten made anyway, but, like, if we did that, I feel like it really wouldn't have gotten made. But, like, because, like, first of all, like, he sucks and is not interesting.
Well, yeah.
Second, like, not really. And second of all, like, yeah, like, it's just not like he's not like the hero of all this, and making it all pivot around this, like, complete cipher who's like a sociopathic, like, infiltrator,
right.
And, like,
well, no, it's
know,
very no. I'm glad you brought that up, because did you ever see Judas and the Black Messiah, the Fred Hampton film that came out a few years ago?
I don't think I ever actually saw it. No, I remember it.
I watched it, and it was a little more. It was like a little bit more. It went a little harder than I expected any kind of Hollywood movie to do, in terms of sort of, like, it definitely portrayed, I think, Fred Hampton in a positive light, and the Black Panthers, and even, their, like, socialist politics, et cetera, but nonetheless, and I think a lot of people got, like, a bad vibe from the movie and, like, didn't like it, and I think there's something there about, like, the undercover cop movie, the movie about, like, a snitch, like, somebody goes and, like, lies. Now, of course, it's interesting, and it's, like, exciting. Ooh, are they going to get caught? Can they pretend to be this person? But, and honestly, I think if there was a movie that, like, we would, in a very reductive way, like, compare, we almost felt pressured to, like, structurally compare this to, is, like, Point Break. What I mean?
Yeah, I forgot that, like, we were, like, saying it's like Point Break at one point. Yeah,
people always love when you say that, because it's relatable and stuff, and, like, takes them out of the 19th century and makes them think about just cool dynamics.
Oh yeah, the fact
that
it takes place in the 19th century, I feel like, is toxic now. Like, even in academia, like, academia 19th century is still okay, but, like, if you go before that, it's, like, kind of gets into toxic territory. Whereas, like, on TV, forget it. The 19th century, like...
Yeah. But nonetheless,
although I did see there was, like, some Western on Netflix recently that, like, Matt Walsh was talking about, how, like, it wasn't woke.
But anyways, like, my main point is that, like, what, Point Break and Judas and the Black Messiah, and essentially, like, the movie Molly Maguire, all have in common is this idea of, like, a guy gets hired, some kind of cop gets hired to go undercover and infiltrate a dangerous group of some kind of radical people. They're doing some dangerous, radical shit. Then he infiltrates them, wins their trust, and gradually realizes that actually, even though their methods are over the top and he can't really approve of them, like, their spiritual vibe, the code they live by, actually might have some, like, validity to it, and there might be something, like, righteous about it. And then he starts to feel very conflicted, but then he's lying, and then his handlers are like, you better take him down, and then something happens, and usually the sort of the Judas, or the Jesus figure, gets, like, somehow sacrificed, but then the cop goes through, like, a spiritual transformation, or at least feels, like, very, like, tortured and regretful about it, like, the end. That's really how all these things, like, go. Like, it's how Molly Maguire ends. The Keanu catches Patrick Swayze, and he lets him surf off into the wave and die. And Judas Black Messiah, obviously Fred Hampton gets murdered, and the movie ends with, like, the snitch being interviewed later, and then it's like, that night he shot himself. It's like, okay, he KMS. So it's like, it's hard to feel really good about that, because it's like, okay, they succeeded in like, using lies, like, and getting, like, building a personal relationship with somebody who actually was, like, a brave person who maybe was, like, an outlaw a little bit, but was, like, fighting for a principle, and you did it for, like, money, or it's, like, just because your job, and then you feel bad. I almost the Molly Maguire movie actually might do the most clear job of at least, having a climactic scene where Sean Connery kind of, yells after trying to, like, murder Richard Harris, in his jail cell, so it says basically, you came here for absolution. Well, like, nothing can absolve you. Like, nothing will save you from the hell, from the curse of, like, what you did. Like, you're fucking scum. Like, blah, blah, blah. And basically says, yeah, like, no, like, oh, like, you get to go be a successful guy in America now. Good for you. Like, you get to run the Denver office of the Pinkertons. You're a celebrity. But, like, you're a piece of shit. and like you're cursed you're going to hell. And then, you know, I think the last line is "see you in hell." Now, you know, I mean, that's maybe about as good as you can do, but there is something like a bad vibe about that, like. Because at the end of the day, like the more I read about McParlane, actually, I am like, actually, this guy is like bad. Like he's actually like really a villainous character.
I always felt that like he sucked. Like that was the big problem with like, the thing was that like he sucked.
You have to make him look kind of cool. You have to like make him do cool stuff and be like charismatic and have people be invested in him. But you're like asking people to get invested with a cop, which was, I think, specifically people's critique of Judas and the Black Messiah was, even though it had a very positive view of Fred Hampton, it's like the movie was really concerned with like the interiority and the feelings of the cop, of the undercover lying cop who betrayed everybody. Like, and it's like, fuck that guy, you know what I mean? So, I mean, you're right. Like, it's a good point to be like, what about the, you know, the doing a Molly Maguire narrative, like only from the perspective of like the Molly Maguires or even the Molly Maguires and Franklin Goen, and McParlane is like, you know, he's in between those two. He's obviously like the connection between those two, but like he's an errand boy at the end of the day. I mean, he's the sad vision of like Irish American like integration, basically, like the ultimate the cop who sells out his own people. Right.
Another part of it, there's a lot of work to be done, honestly, that we didn't do just because like we were so like, you know, we got busy, and then we started doing this, which has like consumed a lot of our energy, especially early on when we were, you know, like really like, I think another part of it is that like there would be, and this was like during, when we first conceived this, it was during that time when everything had to be on TV, not to like go down the rabbit hole of like talking about like, you know, this type of shit, but like that time, like, you know, it had to be a TV show. And I feel like it definitely would make more sense if it were just a single film, because I don't know if you can sustain the level of interest in this when it is something that is like people could look up what happens, like, and read a Wikipedia article about it. I mean, people don't read anymore.
That's a really good point, actually. Yeah.
Like, I feel like knowing that, like, everyone, like, every spark of hope in the story is going to be crushed, like, knowing exactly what's going to happen, and that, like, everyone evil, like, would ultimately prevail. Like, it would just, I think people would lose interest. That was why we kind of tried to have, like, a love story, but that didn't, like, quite come together.
Because nobody can go
we were, like,
with him
halfway
at the
through.
end.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody can go with him at the end. I mean...
That's true. Yeah, exactly. You also know it's not going to work out because he sucks.
Well, honestly, as
like,
we said earlier, like even the imposition, the ambient imposition to like make it like a show that goes like 4 seasons was just like something people used to tell you 10 years ago, but it didn't exactly make sense back then, and like really wouldn't make sense now. Now you would do like a limited series or a movie or something, you know, like. Or you just wouldn't do it because now AI is making movies. Sorry, we're having an Irish wake for Hollywood, but I think it's a funny convergence. I was gonna say, like, at
least be happy that like we didn't like go from being like relatively successful podcasters to like being like failed screenwriters, and instead went from being like not successful screenwriters to being like moderately successful podcasters.
You're right.
Because
I like
that did happen to others. Yeah,
I like that direction. I'm very happy to be sitting here now talking about the Maguires in this format than like trying to squeeze it through like Netflix executives' AI generated notes about like how there needs to be a jig at 4 minutes and 37 seconds because their market research has indicated that our demographic for this show likes watching.
Although, as I was saying before, like
reading
it over, like independently of like the whole thing, like it, you know, the topic itself, like it did remind me like of, you know, the like how fun it was to write creatively, something which I haven't I did a little bit like, you know, on commission, but like something I haven't really done like for myself, like the way like we used to do in like many years. Like maybe, you know, I'll return to it one day, but like I was gonna say, like, I keep like, especially in this episode, like I keep hearing like our third collaborator on this. I feel like we need to think of some kind of like pseudonym for him, like Zed or something, you know, so we can talk about it without calling him like our third collaborator. But like
Zed.
Yeah, exactly. like, but yeah, no, I keep like, cause Zed was like, I definitely asked Zed to be on the show, like, to be like part of SJ, to be like the third mic, but he was like, no, fuck that, like, I don't like fucking podcasts, like, it's bullshit, and like, I could just hear him like talking about like as we're having this conversation, like spiraling out like in a million different directions, like he'd just be like, no, that's fucking bullshit. I'll tell you what it's all about. Like it's about like this. It's about two fucking people who like couldn't, get their shit together, and like you guys fucked up, and you
get the fuck up.
You couldn't focus. You had to go do a fucking podcast and suck each other's dicks.
I mean, I do think, as fun as it was to write, in a way, like researching really arcane aspects of it, I think for both of us became more kind of fun than like trying to sort of like package it into like a TV show format.
I think we could see the writing on the wall and like the solitary writing like by ourselves. Yeah, you're right. The solitary writing by ourselves wasn't really rewarding. What was rewarding was like doing the research and then like
Skyping
having a Zoom conversation about like what
true.
we should
That's
true.
That
And then that is the podcast Subliminal John. Yeah.
It is true. So this, I guess, this will be the end of part one, which I guess was like a long preliminary historical and vibes-based
we'll give ourselves
reflection
some
session.
more time, and we will get into the actual like the meat and potatoes, as it were.
Part two, I think we're gonna dim the lights, and we're gonna draw back that curtain, and then we're gonna jump in media res into the real shit of this story. I don't mean we're not doing a Chugi table read, though. It might be funny to read like one or two scenes.
I don't know. Like
some of them are funny,
but
it might be too. It might be too Chugi.
I don't know if I could have.
No. But I just mean that we're gonna adhere to a little more economy of talking about the story itself, and then everything that like what happened in the actual Molly Maguire. Now that you know a little bit of the kind of like the world of the 1870s. And some of the
the major players and
some of the factors involved.
Context.
Yeah, we're gonna go into kind of like this like hot gaff bottle episode about a specific struggle in the Gilded Age of the 1870s when crooked billionaires were running wild. The Congress, I'm talking about you, Senator Mumma. Is it Mumma or Mummo? Yeah, Senator Joseph Mumma, big piece of shit. People like that, engaging in fraud. I think there's literally a quote in Kenny's book where somebody like accuses Franklin Goad of like fraud, bribery, like deception, like literally like the Gustavus Myers like trinity of allegations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like we'll get right into that, and then I guess the last thing we didn't talk about is the idea of vigilantism itself, of vigilantism itself, kind of having a little bit of a moment now as things are like spiraling. It's been a couple months ago at this point, but I think, we do actually have like a modern example to draw to like Molly Maguireism, which of course is, the CEO shooter kid himself, Luigi Mangione, right?
Yeah, it's true. It is similar. I was thinking about that too as I was reading.
The something about the theatricality of it, like, really strikes me as like, and also people's like almost the visceral reaction, the
fear that like, oh shit, like they're just gonna start killing us, like whoa, like the absolute like panic,
that it
created,
exactly.
It is similar, in that way. Yeah.
I think like the panic that people like Franklin Gowan felt at a certain point from like Molly Maguireism is similar to the way like people have reacted, and also like the population looking at it in a kind of way where like things have gotten bad enough that there's like kind of a surprise. There's a lot of like shocked outrage like in the newspapers about how awful it is, but then of course like there was. Like on the streets, like there are a lot of people that are like, you're right. And sometimes I think when you read about the Molly Maguires, because it is further back, it's not as immediate, right? And you do read about how bad the conditions were in these mines, and like like how little they were paid, how dangerous it was. I think there was an average between 1870 and 1875. I saw one of these statistics. there were like 500 something miners killed just in Schuylkill County, which means like a little over 100 a year in like a not very large population-wise county of Pennsylvania. Like over 100 guys getting killed in the mines, and then like 3 times as many as that like maimed or wounded for life, and like they can't work anymore, right? So like I think another source said that it was a higher casualty rate than being in the Union Army in the Civil War on average, was working these mines, right? So then being, beaten down, trodden like that, having no rights, whatever, getting hyper exploited, and having these Welsh and English guys, riding your ass all day and stuff like that, that some of them would go straight to the boss and post a coffin notice on the door and be like, Thomas, this is your house. And draw a little coffin with a little revolver on it.
Like, he knows you.
A stranger, he knows you. Yeah, it's just like, no, really, like some, like we're this kind of like very poetic, like scary, kind of like mocking tone. And then, one of these guys who's like a bad guy, like, oops, like somebody should, it's like, I think people can look back, you almost get like a thrill of like, oh man, somebody did that. Somebody just said, fuck it. And was like, actually, like, no. Like they took those agrarian violence rules and that sense of like that sort of informal sense of justice and fair play, and when it was violated and there was like absolutely no recourse, I'm like, okay, well, like let's try this out. And so I think that like, there's something similar going on. I think like a commonality is periods of like extreme corporate power and sort of like hoarding of profits and increasing like immiseration of working people and like hyper exploitation of like the working class, which was definitely happening in the 1870s after the post-Civil War boom. You had the financial panic of 1873, another huge like backdrop of this whole saga, right? And when things get like crazy like that, like at a certain point, some people are gonna go fuck it and like kind of go step outside the lines of the law. And it's like it's a very interesting question. We'll get into it next time about like the labor union, which was not about
I gotta
violence.
Give him his dinner. Hold on.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right back. Okay, I thought he was hungry, but I think he might just be playful. So anyway, I'm back.
Oh, okay.
He may return and growl at me some more, but
yeah,
we'll see.
Maybe the last point that makes sense to end on. So we're talking about that kind of vigilantism happening when like when the contradictions really increase and class conflict is heightened and everything, and certain people looking at that and being like, oh, okay, like if things are bad enough, people might start to get down with that kind of thing. I'm reminded of like ever since I first heard about this story, I keep thinking about like the old story in my family. I think I might have brought it up before, maybe the last St. Patrick's Day episode or not. But one of those old apocryphal stories I learned through like my mom's family, the Irish family in coal country. And one of them, who I think we adopted as like a name in our script, in our pilot, right?
Yeah.
I think his name was Dennis Fortune.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Remember him?
Yes.
Yeah. So apparently what happened to him, he was working in one of these mines up by Scranton, or, in Luzerne County, up by there, Carbondale, whatever. And I think he was a foreman. And one morning there was like some kind of like explosion or collapse in the mine. So him and some guys like went down the shaft because some guys had gotten like trapped or something. So they went down there to like get him out. And then we were down there was a secondary explosion. And then him and a bunch of other guys got killed. So this would have been, I don't know, like my great-great-great-grandfather, I guess. And so then they dug their bodies out, and then they took them on a carriage or whatever, and they dropped off the body at like his family's house, and then they shoved, and like my mom this is like a story she'd always, I guess, hear from like my grandmother. This is like a story she'd always tell, and you know what they did? They put a half a day's pay in his pocket and like dumped his body on the back porch. Because you know why I have a day's pay? Because he died before noon. And like that's a pretty good anecdote of like what the fuck it was like up there. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Like we have as bad, as rough as things get today, like think of the idea of like no labor laws, like children working in the breakers, like picking slate out from like coal and like cutting their fingers up for like 9 hours a day. And then old men, after they get injured and can't mine anymore, like go back at the end of their lives and like pick it. There's some saying about that, like you're twice a boy, once a man, or something like that, you know. But like that was the level. Like, no, you don't get any insurance if you die. Oh, you die before noon. So I think, and that was up near Scranton, where there wasn't as much Molly Maguire activity for like a variety of particular reasons with the coal corporations up there, where they were able to sort of like tamp down that sort of activity. But in Schuylkill, those conditions arguably are even worse than that, you know? And so in those conditions where like you have the fatality rate of like being in a war zone, you're probably going to get poisoned to death. You have no avenue of advancement because you're like a poor Irish Catholic and they're not like promoting you to being a contract miner. So you end up just being a laborer like for years, for 9-10 hours a day. And then people are pissing you off and cheating you. And remember, that was one of the first coffin notices I feel like we found of like Thomas, like, if you don't stop cheating the men, like this above will be your home in a short time, you know, little coffin drawing. Like, you know, it comes back to fairness and justice. And like when it exceeds a certain thing, you know, some things are going to happen. But next time we'll get into what they did and
what they did, yeah.
And what capitalism did in response at how the dialectic of history unfurled.
It happened just short years ago. It occurred in the shafts of a dark, fiery mine with the land above white with blue snow. Well, the mine boss says, go rob that pillar, and you'll do it for the money I love. And the hell with the safety inspector, and be damned to the river above. When they were working and the digging was going quite well, they blasted away that huge column of coal, and with a great roar down it fell. Well, the mine collapsed at that moment, and the river poured into the hole, and 81 miners they ran through the shafts like the devil was after their soul. Men made their way to the sunlight, and thank God he chose them to stay. But 12 of their comrades to this very day must lie in the watery grave. Now the mine shafts are deep and they're narrow, they dream and rich in their days. But everyone knows that the black diamond holes have taken much more than